ME05 continues to serve.
Part 7, Luhmann and Mukarovsky extrapolated. Quotation: between art and society, the process of aesthetic value has always been quick to respond to the dynamics of social interrelations, since it is at once predetermined by that dynamics and it acts upon by a backlash effect. End quote. Jan Mukarovsky from Aesthetic Function, Norm and Value as Social Facts. Another quote: no system is able to operate outside of its own boundaries. A system can extend its boundaries, but it cannot operate in the environment. For example, the brain is not an open system, but a closed system. The electric language of a brain can be used only within the brain. The brain, or the nervous system, has no access to the environment. It is completely closed, and closure in this sense is the condition of openness, and that's the difficulty. End quote. Luhmann, The Closure of the Legal System.
An unanswered question still hangs over this text, not much considered. If what defines art as art in its current determining conditions is at least in part that it is characteristically unteachable, ideological and closed, what is left of art? What is left of art devoid of its teachable element that to a significant extent defined it in its entirety? What trace of art remains beyond its transition into ideology, where art constitutes a teachable element? What leftovers persist in the vacuous remnants of the ideological apparatus of art, still just about standing with the assistance of its apparatus of the system of art? It appears that its retreat into an autotelic, autopoietic, self-defining, self-describing, self-producing system is a result of the absence that initiates this question. If art's purposes become entirely estranged from any meaningful pursuit of the accumulation of knowledge, and essentially identifying itself with a drive to obviate improvement, it is reduced to functioning merely as a job of maintenance. It must therefore constitute the thinnest example of what Humboldt called the absolute essential importance of human development in its richest diversity. At the point in which art becomes unteachable, it became imperative to establish and maintain a collective sense of relevance and validation, to tie the new and teachable mutation of art with its teachable historic predecessors, as if current forms of art that could no longer rely on the criterion of validation, that was by implication teachable, constitute a seamless continuum of the objective facts of qualitative measure that have been constitutive and essential elements of the unfolding of the established historical progression of art. Subsequently, one of the purposes of this text is to consider the situation in hand that art cannot be taught, and therefore the dissolution of art education, or rather to argue for the dissolution of the notion that art, in its current conditions, as it currently operates, can be taught, and therefore the dissolution of art education in the form that it is currently elaborated and realised.
Regarding the current conditions in which art is produced, art itself can be thought of analogously. That doesn't look right. Within the following quote, with the phrase Russian soil. In the following quote, all the calamities attending the epoch of primitive accumulation, aggravated 100-fold by the transplantation into Russian soil of the most modern methods of plunder, elaborated by the all-powerful Monsieur Coupon. Lenin, quote from Lenin. And that the art world is analogous to Tolstoy's impotent position in regard to the imposition of an accelerating capitalism, that the opposition to private property in land did not lead to concentrating the struggle against the real enemy, landlordism, and its political instrument of power, i.e. the monarchy, but led to the mere dreamy, diffuse and impotent lamentations. Landlordism supplants, with regard to the analogy with art to the institution's functionaries, while the monarchy is analogous with art's institution. Similarly, the state to society and the institution to the artist.
Thinking about Lerman's contention that the content of closed social systems can be determined or influenced by the environment and vice versa, and that the system, though limited, as in the superstructure's relative impotence in relation to the base, can change or influence the environment, but the closed system cannot operate beyond its own boundaries. For this to be useful for the maintenance of an art practice, some elaboration on what constitutes the difference between operate and influence in the context of being operative within the distinction between system and environment, with particular emphasis on the distinction itself, will be necessary. What distinguishes the use of operate and influence in terms of how the system of art interacts and communicates with the social environment beyond its boundaries? For the example, art's ability to produce change in society. Operate suggests a level of direct integrated involvement, whereas influence suggests a level of indirect interaction corresponding to the effectiveness or impotence of communication, rather than with some form of active agency or direct intervention. From the point of view of the system, can the environment determine the content of the closed system? Is determination reciprocal in this way, which would mean external influence is possible on the closed system, but the environment from which the system is cleaved cannot operate or act with any direct form of agency within the system? The system then is operative only within its own self-defining terms, as if the environment in that only influence, communication and indirect intervention are possible between the system and its environment.
In other words, a system cannot operate in the environment. It is distinct from the environment, but the system can expand and retract, like a cartoon cat trapped in a sack, into and out of the environment. The cat could get lucky and strike its assailant from within the sack, but it cannot use its ability to look cute in order to appeal to some repressed childhood love of animals in its captor, in order to attempt to secure its release.
There are contradictions in the current text. One in particular that constitutes a full-blown dialectical antinomy is illustrated by the pair of quotes at the beginning of this penultimate part of the entire present text. Although Mukarovsky elsewhere earlier argued a more formalist, isolated approach to aesthetic evaluation, treating the work of art as a closed unit, unencumbered by society, and Lerman qualifies later on in the same source that poetic systems, self-reproducing systems, closed systems by the operation of producing the system with the means of the system itself, does not mean that there is no influence from the environment to the system, or from the system to the environment. There can be any kind of causal relations, interdependencies of all kinds of real possibilities. But you can talk about closure if you focus on the operations of the system as such. This could give some validity to the following and potential usefulness of thinking about maintaining an art practice from the perspective of this and other contradictions in the current conditions of artistic production in the present text. And to think now, following Mukarovsky, that the problem of the aesthetic value of a work of art that is independent of external influences can simply not be avoided, even in the unlikely event it exists. Also, to think from Lerman's question, how can a closed system construct openness? Or, how is it possible to have a closed system which nevertheless transcends its own boundaries, but not at an operational level, not in using its own operation to contact the environment, but somehow differently? Which, by the way, he elaborates as, the system is able to internalize the difference of internal and external, to use the distinction of system-environment within the system. They cannot operate in the environment, but they can use the distinction of system and environment to guide internal operation. The distinction of system and environment can re-enter the system. Systems are liable to transform the original distinction, the discrimination, the drawing of a boundary into a distinction that they can use within the system. So the distinction within, without, is itself brought within the system and used to structure its contents. This process within the system, or of re-entry, can therefore infiltrate an ideological version of the environment beyond its own boundaries, in the form of some kind of simulacrum within its boundaries, allowing the environment to transcend the system's boundaries. Similarly, the system can transcend its boundaries and assert some contact with the environment, although without being in any way operative within the environment.
Nicholas Luhmann's use of the term closure considers how a system can use the distinction of within, without, within the system itself, to acknowledge the distinction and subsume it within the system, therefore accessing the distinction within, without traversing its own boundaries, which would require an abnegation of being operatively functional as art, at least the operation of art as it exists within arthood, a condition we'll attempt to name in due course. By identifying art as a social system, a distinction is indicated, because, to quote Spencer Brown, distinction is perfect containment. The space in which the distinction is identified is severed or cloven. Spencer Brown, a quote from Spencer Brown, that is to say, a distinction is drawn by arranging a boundary with separate sides so that a point on one side cannot reach the other side without crossing the boundary. For example, in a plane space, a circle draws a distinction. Diagram A. The drawing of the distinction indicates the system has reached a level of operational closure. The distinction within, without, indicated by the system, brings the distinction inside the boundary of the distinction. Diagram B. This constitutes the re-entry of the system by the system. Perfect containment means the system cannot operate beyond the boundary of its distinction. But we know that a closed system can communicate with the environment from which its distinction has severed it. For example, that art can be purchased by a financial institution suggests some form of reciprocal communication between within the system and without the system. Diagram C.
The system of art can traverse its own boundaries, but it cannot be operative beyond its own boundaries. For example, art can reference a danger to life and limb, such as depict or describe images of brutality, but it cannot itself constitute a danger to life and limb. If a bronze sculpture topples from its plinth and pushes the artistic director of the institution in which it is housed to death, no special province of of artistic attribution can be directly implicating the loss of life, much like Brecht's Messinkauf, that eradicates any potential aesthetic property of a brass instrument when sold at scrap metal price calculated by weight.
As stated, there is a contradiction embedded in the present text. As the text is an outcome of the attendant art practice, the contradiction must also be embedded in the practice. The contradiction is significant to the art practice. We base the validity of the immediately foregoing sentence on the fact that the content of the contradiction itself has dominated to a large extent the text so far. The contradiction is the result of two apparently opposing positions being held simultaneously. One, that we are saying art constitutes a social formation or sphere of activity that is closed, a social system that is essentially autotelic in that it functions entirely for the reproduction of itself, and is autopoetic in that it is reproducing in terms of self-describing, self-defining itself. And perhaps most significantly, that the system, in its self-enclosed capacity, cannot exit itself, so to write. It cannot touch in any meaningful, effective, substantive way, in Newman's terms, operate the real world beyond its own self-defined parameters. Two, that we are saying the system of art, illustrated most conspicuously in the artistic output it generates within the relations of its distribution, is above all socially and ultimately economically determined. And in fact that this is so much the case that the artwork as a distinct entity, if that is what it is not discernible from any ordinary commodity. That the art system is entirely integrated into capitalist society, so much so that the system of art constitutes a social system where large-scale capitalist economic activity and cultural production are inseparable. The first of these propositions appears to be interior or closed, and the second exterior or open. Thus the apparent contradiction. Perhaps it is conceivable that rather than the text operating within a contradiction, it in fact represents an amalgam of both positions, that somehow some exterior activity does penetrate the boundaries of the system's interior in a determining capacity, but once inside, as it were, is captive and immediately subsumed as content. In this formulation, the real world determines the social system of art, but the system itself can determine nothing beyond its boundaries, only itself. The formulation is structurally closer to the model of the base and the superstructure, the economically determining base producing the economically determined superstructure. In the context of the system of art, this translates as the material base consisting of the wider social reality, the fabric of the institutions, the infrastructure, its organisation of funding, bodies, finance, etc., and the creative, reactive, artistic superstructure, the meanings, the values, artworks of the system.
The problem with this formulation is that it assumes it to be all one-way traffic, that the system of art is significantly informed by what exists beyond its boundaries, but cannot itself inform or even interact with anything beyond its self-described boundaries. This formulation doesn't allow for the fact that in terms of art, there is clear evidence of the superstructure having some determining effect against the general torrent of determination on the base, indicating, if not exactly two-way traffic, at least something like a blowback when it comes to artistic determination. Mukarovsky considers the interiority of art against the exteriority of the environment in terms of aesthetic, non-aesthetic spheres, but with crossover between the two. Aesthetic objects can make incursions into the environment, i.e. penetrates art's boundaries and become diffuse, and non-aesthetic objects can enter into art, but attention is focused on the inside looking outwards. As we seek to identify the bounds of the aesthetic sphere that set it all apart from the non-aesthetic, we must bear in mind that the two areas are not fully separate or discontinuous. There is a constant dynamic relationship between them, and they may be described as dialectical antinomy, and that this hints at one of the natural bridges between art and the remaining sphere of the aesthetic. There are, of course, very many other routes by which norms migrate straight from the high art that sets them into the non-artistic sphere. The various institutions of art, their funding structures, sponsorship deals, corporate infrastructure, etc., must presumably belong or be heavily integrated into the base. In our contradictory formulation, this at least isn't doubted. Museums, art fairs, publishers, their attendant banks, airlines, car manufacturers, sponsors' logos, what constitute a part of the state and economic apparatus, the part of the base most pertinent to art determines the output of artists. What constitutes the art system superstructure? For Mukarovsky, as far as what produces the conditions of evaluating art are concerned, it is solely that creates the institutions and authoritative bodies through which it exerts its influence on aesthetic value by regulating how works of art are appraised. These institutions include the apparatus of criticism, the role of experts, art classes in schools, to which we cannot add colleges of art and institutions whose role it is to cultivate passive contemplation, the art market and its promotional machinery, surveys held to determine the most valuable work, art exhibitions, museums, public libraries, competitions, prizes, academies, and often even censorship. But it seems clear that within the sphere of art, determination also works the other way, that the institutions that constitute the base are to some extent determined by the superstructural activity. For example, it is clear that the appearance, theoretical approach, and organisation of the innumerable institutions built around a distended elaboration of art are partly determined by various historical examples of the superstructure. For example, Gary's Bilbao Guggenheim is a vast institutional object constituting a reconfiguration of Russian constructivism with a vacuous postmodern spin. Samuel Richardson's development of the novel's form influence upon the book publishing industry, that the vagaries of the art market are less so vagaries than reflections of the trends active within the current art scene, but overtly reified, professionalised and made to fit to a higher end form of consumption. Auction houses, art consultants, etc. Art functions as an indicator of the general economy in the form of assets as luxury goods, their value indicating both the wealth of the elite strata of society as well as the relative poverty and the majority wealth of failure.
This all indicates that the topographical models of considering the art system in relation to the external environment or the real world as an impenetrably closed system, or the base superstructure model, are all inconsistent and not conclusively applicable to the situation of maintaining an art practice in current conditions. They don't allow for dialectical antimony. As Drew Milne points out, perhaps the artistic sphere is possibly not so much a sphere but a set of conflictual and shifting relations in which the decisions as to the boundary between art and other social activities is a series of disagreements and discussions. This seems to cohere with Mukarovsky. There is no solid borderline between the aesthetic and extra-aesthetic spheres. There are no objects or actions which, by virtue of their essence or organic structure, that are, regardless of time, place or the person evaluating them, carriers of an aesthetic function, and others which, again, by their particular adaptation, would be necessarily placed outside its range. Thus, the bounds of the sphere that is aesthetics are not set by reality itself, and they are highly subject to change. Change and interchanges is central to Mukarovsky's understanding of art in relation to the exterior environment. These formulations of thinking about art are likely inconsistent with what constitutes art now as opposed to then. Then, being some past period where art's validity was straightforwardly aligned with the artist's task and the audience's, patrons, clients, etc. expectations. They don't allow for a formulation of art as something somewhat distinct from what it would be, possibly what it once was, for the formulation to be accurate or applicable. These modes of thinking about art are dependent on a relatively autonomous or singular notion of the artwork as meaning some amalgamated effect of the cause of both artistic intention and the audience's apprehension, interpretation, etc. The kind of object Victor Shklovsky describes when he writes, by works of art, quote, by works of art in the narrow sense, we mean works created by special techniques designed to make the works as obviously artistic as possible, end quote. Or leavis that art is, quote, something that should contain within itself the reason why it is so and not otherwise, end quote. But what art is, and consequently the modes in which art is thought about, appear significantly derailed from this reassuring formulation when considering art in its current manifestation. What is neglected is that art as it currently exists is not simply the sum total of its various examples of individual artworks, but rather a social system that produces artworks in the sense of commodities, while also producing an ideology through which to access and consume them, i.e. ideological apparatus.
Makarowski proposes that what he calls aesthetic value, which is the outcome of aesthetic function, contains certain aesthetic norms which constitute the criterion by which aesthetic value is judged, is not fixed within a given aesthetic object or artifact. This suggests a division between the object and the possibility of an aesthetic potential, which is temporarily dependent on the aesthetic object or artifact. Quote, we have already suggested that the immediate object of an aesthetic evaluation is not a material artifact, but the aesthetic object, that is, its reflection and correlate in the observer's consciousness. Nevertheless, any objective, i.e. independent and permanent aesthetic value, as far as it exists, has to be sought in the material artifact, which alone endures without change, while an aesthetic object is changeable, being defined not only by its organic structure and by the properties of the material artifact, but also by the given stage of development of the non-material structure of art. End quote. Makarowski echoes Nelson Guzman's question regarding context when establishing the manifestation of the essential property. What gives it its conceptual independence of the work of art? When is art? One may also cite instances of the opposite, where works of art, the privileged bearers of the aesthetic function, may lose it and then be either destroyed or superfluous, as with the obliteration of old frescoes or graffiti by being painted or plastered over, or they may become used without regard to their aesthetic purposes, as with the conversion of ancient palaces to army barracks, etc. There are, however, within art and beyond it, things that by virtue of their organic structure are meant to have an aesthetic effect. In the case of art, that is its core attribute. However, an active capacity for function aesthetically is not an inherent property of an object, even if it were deliberately created with that in mind. It only transpires under certain circumstances, specifically in a given social context. With regard to identifying what Makarowski calls aesthetic value, its status is not that of a permanent attribute, somehow imbued into the artistic object, positioned between its autonomous production and the potential communal consumption. It is more some conceptually independent property that could be there one minute and gone the next. What seems significant about Makarowski's consideration of aesthetic value is the idea that the material aspect of a given work of art can be split apart from the conceptually independent property that supplies it with its esoteric artistic reification. This is another quote. Above all, the work of art itself is far from being constant. With each shift in time, space or social milieu, the artistic tradition applicable to one time, the prism through which a work is perceived changes, and the effect of these shifts is to alter also the aesthetic object that corresponds in the mind of a given collectivity to the material artifact, something created by an artist. It is around these conditions that the autotelic and autopoietic system of art establishes itself, that the material properties of the work do not necessarily constitute the material that determines the work of art. The artwork consists then of two general properties, its material realisation and its conceptual independence, specifically as art. Neither are particularly stable, evidenced in the former by destruction, for example, core-based stone breakers being maintained through reproduction, and the latter by transference of the object's esoteric property, for example Duchamp's or anyone else's ready-made being retained, even if the armut signature was scratched off and the object plumbed into a public toilet, returned as it were to its original purpose. This goes against the notion of the changeless perpetuity of an aesthetic value independent of exterior influences, which negates the contention that the art object is a commodity like any other, but can in at least one sense support the notion of the artwork as the output of a closed social system. The artistic object conceived as the thing remaining constant, but at the same time admitting that the change in its location, environment, etc. affects shifts in the thing's meaning. Historical examples of work both remaining consistent as an artifact and are simultaneously subject to atrophy or conversely periodic restoration that has a bearing on physical changes. The institution organised around any given artwork can equally change, and in doing so change meaning. Active curatorial practices, for example, might seek to re-examine the work in a contemporary situation, as evidenced in examples of publicly owned art celebrating colonialism, re-evaluated for a post-colonial or rather neo-colonial context. In such situation, Mukarovsky differentiates between living, historic, representative, academic, exclusive or popular values. The work of art, while gradually swapping one for another or implementing several of them, simultaneously may persist as an internal value, such persistence being not a state, but, just as with the works whose position on the scale does not change, a process.
The following quote from Mukarovsky is useful in terms of us continuing from the position he takes of the artwork that it consists of two general properties: its material realization and its conceptual independence, specifically as art. So here's an extended quote from Mukarovsky. It transpires then that aesthetic value is a process whose motion is determined on one hand by the imminent development of the very structure of art. Think of the tradition applicable at a given time as the backdrop against which any work is evaluated, and on the other by the motion of and shifts in the structure of social coexistence. The placing of a work of art at a particular point on the scale of aesthetic value and its survival there, or its relocation to another point on the scale, or even its removal from the scale altogether, are dependent on other factors than just the attributes of the material object created by the artist, which alone is what endures as it passes from age to age, place to place, or from one social environment to another. It would be wrong to refer here to relativity, since for an evaluator rooted at a given point in time and space and wedged in a particular social environment, this or that value of a given work is a necessary and constant quality. The independent aesthetic value inherent to a material artistic artifact, assuming that there is one, is, in comparison to the actual value of an aesthetic object, merely potential. A materialist artistic artifact constructed in such and such a way has the ability, irrespective of the stage of development of the whole structure of art, to evoke in the minds of observers aesthetic objects with a positive hic nunc aesthetic value. So any question as to the existence of an objective aesthetic value can only be framed in terms of whether such an organic structure of a material artistic artifact is possible. That's the end of the quote.
The art practice, of which the present text constitutes a not necessarily artistic output, draws a distinction between art and arthood, and it identifies a correlation between this distinction and this distinction Mukarovsky draws between an aesthetic object, which for us is called art, and a material artifact, which for us we can call arthood. We also allow, again, after Mukarovsky's, for the propensity of aesthetic value to change, and for some interchangeability between the two distinct states. Regarding the distinction between art and arthood, generally the proposition is that arthood is determined economically, socially, etc., whereas art is a distinct property, distinct from society. It cannot be engaged socially. If it does, it becomes arthood. In the light of this, and Goodman observing, the real question is not what objects are permanently works of art, but when is an object or work of art, or more briefly, when is art? We are prompted to ask and work towards answering the question, when is arthood?
How can we state, as we have throughout the present text, that art constitutes an ideology, that it is therefore distinct from real knowledge, real life, a self-describing closed system, etc., and within the very same text state that the art object constitutes a form of commodity? Surely the commodity form represents the most conspicuously invasive, socially and economically determined entity, so foundationally integrated into the superstructural real world like nothing else on earth. Is the solution something along the lines that the artwork constitutes a mildly defamiliarized form of commodity, as elaborated by Shklovsky, made unfamiliar by its status as art, while therefore retaining a conceptual independence from society? If artworks, whatever they are, for Brecht, the things that, quote, have to form the ideological superstructure for a solid, practical rearrangement of our age's way of life, still harbour some remnant of art, it is well buried beneath an excessive and rampantly opportunistic cultural ideological apparatus. Arthood is constructed and conditioned to necrotize art in the same way that capitalism is hardwired to necrotize life. It constitutes a parasitoidic sphere of activity accumulated around a now probably long dead host. If there is any remnant of life still hanging on, its chances of survival have been very seriously compromised.
If capitalism reduces life to a state of meaninglessness, art is often viewed as its antithesis, as a means of resistance. Capitalist society devours everything as subsequently life inevitably becomes habitual. Interaction between people and things is nullified to an unconscious operation. For Shklovsky, art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. That's from Artist Technique. Trapped in an alienated state and calcified within capitalist society, the technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar. But as Trotsky points out, however fantastic art may be, it cannot have at its disposal any other material except that which is given to it by the world of three dimensions and by the narrow world of class society. That's from Literary Revolution. And ultimately, the assertion of complete independence of the aesthetic factor from the influence of social conditions, as is made by Shklovsky, as an instance of specific hyperbole whose roots, by the way, lie in social conditions too. The constructions of the formulas have the same kind of defective methodology that every kind of idealism has.
For Shklovsky, art constitutes the imposition, or rather the revelation, of the extraordinary in relation to the ordinary in aesthetic things, situations, actions, etc. Thus, the male and female genitals in Sadovokov's collective riddles of the Russian people get referred to in terms of lock and key. In this way, art reveals itself as enacted by these three words themselves, in their ability to defamiliarize the reader's familiarity with both the three separate words themselves, and the sexual reproductive organs they evoke is in estranged form. This defamiliarization is constituted within the form of the work, as in the formulation of words in literary output. For the Russian formalists, a poem is a combination of sounds, a painting is a combination of colour spots, and the laws of art are the laws of verbal combinations and of combinations of colour spots. Quote from Trotsky there. The formalist methodology sees art in terms of pure form and as distinct form, having been socially determined. Words may be socially determined, but the art they initiate by their various defamiliarizing combinations emerges at the point of writing and reading, long after their etymological social development of the words. The superficiality and reactionary character of the formalist theory of art, Trotsky is quote from Trotsky, is summed up by Shklovsky's as, quote, art was always free of life, and its colour never reflected the colour of the flag which waved over the fortress of the city, end quote.
Trotsky's opposition to Shklovsky and the formalist methodology is based on their repudiation that the producer and the recipient of any given artwork are themselves determined by their social conditioning. Art may be to some extent autonomous and independent, but is not a disembodied element feeding on itself, but a function of social man is dissolubly tied to his life and environment. The artist who creates this form and the spectator who is enjoying it are not empty machines, one for creating form and the other for appreciating it. They are living people with crystallized psychology representing a certain unity, even if not entirely harmonious. This psychology is the result of social conditions. The creation and perception of art forms is one of the functions of this psychology, and no matter how wise the formalists try to be, their whole conception is simply based upon the fact that they ignore the psychological unity of the social man who creates and who consumes what is being created.
The formalists' emphasis on art in its pure form echoes the characterization of art as distinct from commodity production. This classification inevitably raises the issue of art as rooted in class division. The gloss of the institutions where art coalesces with notions of success, affirmation and validation belies an aspect of artistic production maintained in the interests of the dominant culture, of a form of social organisation in the interests of a privileged established class. Thus, these forms of concepts of art and criticism are forms of class specialism and control of a general social practice, and a class limitation of the questions which it might come about. Each class has its own policy in art. That is, a system of presenting demands on art with changes with time, for instance. The Maecenas-like protection of court and grand seigneur, the automatic relationship of supply and demand, which is supplemented by complex methods of influencing the individual. The rising bourgeoisie led, on the whole, to the theory of pure art.
The system of art's class constructions are reminiscent of the formalist idealist defective methodologies of autonomy or pure art. Arted, as we have seen with it from the example of Jeremy Deller's Battle of Orgreave, similarly differentiates itself from the industrial, social, material basis, as if produced in an aesthetic vacuum, and consequently becomes obfuscating and complex through the autonomous production of an esoteric subterfuge, strengthen and develop their own self-described characteristics of a specially formulated province of activity, and attempt to disassociate itself from any acknowledgement that the aesthetic remains a function of social organisation. The artwork is reduced to a complete static entity by way of an abortive idealism, disengaged from practice, from social processes, and considered only in terms of an essence, whose constituent parts, when considered of a piece, constitute its meaning, rather than of being part of a process within a social formation.
Arthood constitutes an entire apparatus of activity and relations integrated with capitalist forms of production. Arthood obscures the thing, whatever it is, that constitutes art. It obstructs its capacity to operate. In this way, arthood constitutes an alienated form of art, an ideological form of art, a defamiliarised form of art, and the artistic output of an operatively closed social system. Arthood parasitically colonises art and constructs an infrastructure around it that subjugates its potential while at the same time exploiting art's rich historical reserves. Arthood produces a matrix of professionalism, administration and bureaucracy. It inaugurates within the system the growth of and maintains the reproduction of the commodity form, the institution, the art market, the corporatist art world, and all pervasive relations of marketing and communications. Arthood facilitates a capitalist social formation where large-scale economic activity and cultural production are inseparable. Arthood creates the conditions in which art is produced, distributed and consumed.
Problematically, throughout this text we're using the term art indiscriminately, as it is used almost entirely universally by anyone and everyone. The only areas of this form of usage where the use of art borders on some hesitant forms of discrimination are in distinguishing between itself and lower forms of, possibly artistic. Artistic is used less assuredly, declaratively than art. Note the substantive difference between they are artistic and they have produced something, they have produced some art. Or similarly, creative activity such as amateur art, commercial art, or in distinguishing between art and craft, or between art and other forms of lower cultural or creative activity. The distinction between art and arthood, i.e. our particular use of art, specifically in relation to arthood, that arthood renders inert, is not intended to be directly synonymous with any general usage. Art in this specific sense is what is potentially produced within the self-describing closed system of art, or rather arthood. Importantly, it is the use of the term art that has to remain unreliable and in dispute. Our use of the word art in this context is specifically used in its relation to the word arthood, from which it maintains an almost indistinguishable relation. From here on in, where necessary to explicitly indicate the situation of art, specifically in the form of its historical continuity as operative within arthood, the invented term art, and that's with the ash, the grapheme AE, so it's art distinct from both art and arthood is used. It is used sparingly to distinguish it from the other two distinct intended meanings, to clearly make the point that art, with the ash, should be treated as invisibly present with every subsequent occurrence of the words art and arthood throughout the remainder of the present text, and throughout the entirety of the text of any subsequent rereading. The specific intended meaning of art with an ash is elaborated in more details as:
it is this new definition of art with the ash grapheme, distinct from art without the grapheme, that arthood infiltrates, or that constitutes a nucleus that arthood, having attached itself, can proceed to grow and reproduce itself around. Put clearly, art with the ash grapheme is the historic continuity of art without the grapheme in the current conditions of arthood. Arthood needs art with the grapheme to reproduce. Art with the grapheme constitutes an entity mutually codependent with arthood that arthood is reliant on but is not and cannot itself become. In some increasingly prevalent circumstances, arthood's exploitation of art with the ash grapheme use value is so intense that its properties are depleted to the point of effacement. Without it, arthood cannot be distinguished from the pure commodity form. The art fair industry is perhaps the most conspicuous spectacle where this is enacted. As stated, the exact property that art with the ashgrapheme contains is difficult to identify, but is clearly intrinsically tied to the notion of art historical continuity, as without this. Arthood is exposed as only a superficial facile Potemkin structure, a form of esoteric subterfuge. So art with the ashgrapheme is distinct from art without the grapheme in being specifically inseparable from arthood. It emerges in only the specific context of arthood, which is generally distinct from art. Arthood constitutes the closed, self-describing system of art, which is a fully formed ideology in its alienated capacity as a social formation, where capitalist economic relations are inseparable from cultural activity. The relations of this social formation delineate the operative function of art, spelt with the ashgrapheme, which constitutes a trace but essential element for the reproduction of arthood, so to seamlessly integrate into the capitalist system.
Where art is, arthood isn't, and vice versa. Although arthood requires art to maintain its own reproduction, and art is ever more significantly reliant on arthood for its reproduction, i.e. the superstructure to some limited extent determining the base, the two conditions are mutually exclusive of each other. An aesthetic object immersed in arthood, socially dormant as it were, but materially increasing in value in an oligarch's vault, is not art. Equally, an aesthetic object immersed in art, emancipated from arthood, and this is significantly harder to imagine, producing some far-off isolated community, free of notions such as exchange value, flourishing socially, knitted together by a system of potlatch or use value, is not arthood. Art and arthood are entirely distinct from each other. They function as being mutually exclusive, but they can be operative within the same aesthetic object, or rather, an aesthetic object is capable of shifting between the two conditions. Becoming more engaged with one means becoming less engaged with the other. Like the rabbit duck illustration deployed by Wittgenstein, one observes either a rabbit or a duck, but does not observe both simultaneously. It is conceivable that an object could be entirely engaged with in one condition and through shifts in circumstances become entirely engaged with in the opposing condition. The ratio of art to arthood is determined by conditions and in no way by artistic intention. Presumably artists intend to make artworks. That they in actual fact don't is a socially entrenched misconception. Consider an analogous hypothetical illustration. The aesthetic object art dealership illustration, or in this case the Picasso Gagosian illustration. I don't know, I waste my voice on that one. That's not a question.
Feel free.
Yeah, imagine viewing a reproduction on a computer screen of Picasso's painting, such as The Reservoir, Hotel dell'Ebro, 1909, a flattened out geometric landscape, early cubism, etc. It's a high quality digital reproduction. The brushstrokes of the original painting are clearly discernible. On close inspection, the tooth of the canvas, the oil paint was applied to it, is identifiable. One feels, although in a clearly limited sense due to the nature of the mechanically reproducing images of paintings where colour, tone, texture, physicality, etc. to some greater or lesser extent inevitably obscured, that one is looking at an example of art. Nothing extraneous, or at least within the screen, is complicating one's perception, as might be the case in seeing the work hung on the walls in the Museum of Modern Art, where it is housed. Other works in the vicinity, sponsors' logos on the title card, etc. But clicking the escape key reveals the reproduction to be on the Gagosian Gallery art dealership website. It appears Gagosian has some corporate interference in the estate of Picasso, and presumably for that reason it is reproduced on that website along with other works by Picasso. One immediately becomes conscious of the thing as an object of exchange value, status symbol, luxury good, addition to asset accumulation and commodity form. and whether one might be able to see or not see, for that matter, the tooth of the canvas Picasso constructed the oil-painted image, one doesn't actually want to look at it at all anymore. Not with the Gagosian logo and copyright symbol butted up against the apprehension of the work. One can enlarge the image again, or open in a new tab and close the offending tab, and attempt to start looking again from scratch, to see the artwork and the spectacle of the capitalist commodity form simultaneously is not possible. This gives an indication that art and arthood are mutually exclusive, but still potentially operative at close quarters, even within the confines of one aesthetic object.
Arthood, like capitalism, its progenitor, is nothing if not democratic. Capitalism will exploit anything and anyone without discrimination, irrespective of individual or social characteristics, with the exception of, due to the rigged nature of the reproduction, the capitalist class itself. Within the sphere of arthood, all artworks are equal, whereas in the sphere of art, equality is non-existent. Here, a hierarchy is constructed that attempts to distinguish some aesthetic objects as more significant, more important, etc. than others. In this sense, arthood, as a non-discriminating, pluralistic sphere of activity, subsumes and appropriates for its own validation a discriminating sphere of activity. Some vestige of art persists, for instance, in secondary education, where a student who may have selected art as a subject option might be told to try doing it again better, more accurately, more blue, bigger, whatever better equates to in this context. Students studying GCSE art are assessed on the basis of their ability to demonstrate certain activities at levels of accomplishment ranging from minimal to exceptional. In the initial stages of art taught within higher education, this is task number one, to eradicate such language as even relevant, let alone significant. If an argument for qualitative judgments between examples of art or of individual examples at temporarily distinct moments in their production, i.e. they are better at the end of their production than at any time throughout, can be sustained, then claims of validity of authorial intention can also be sustained. If some artworks are better or worse than others, then the decisions of the people who bring them into existence are effective and substantive. But this is difficult to align with a form of production that relies on the proposition that artworks, by simply being artworks, by whatever declarative means, are valid. And any qualitative discrimination between examples within that proposition are terminated, with responses like that of Orwell's at the beginning of the present text regarding Tolstoy's apparently false proposition, quote, "There is no kind of evidence or argument by which one can show that Shakespeare or any other writer is good, nor is there any way of definitively proving that Shakespeare or any other writer is bad," end quote from Orwell. At least it is difficult to align with a form of production that relies on the proposition that art, simply by being art, is valid, without some additional configuration of the base superstructure topographical model, that art as conceived within the superstructure is complicated by the reality of its operative function. Art is distinct from arthood in its commitment to a continuation of art, a historical continuity. This is the clearest definition of art, spelt with the ash grapheme, that it constitutes the historic continuity of art in the current conditions of arthood. The principal characteristic of that historical continuity is an adherence to a discriminating faculty, to engage in holding that some output is better or worse than some other output, as opposed to the excessive pluralism of arthood, where all art is equally art, so equally valid. As stated, attempts to distinguish some aesthetic object as more significant, more important, etc. than others constitutes an indication of art, using the spelling with the ash grapheme. This difficult commitment distinguishes art from arthood. but maintaining at least a pursuit or even a working awareness that some artworks might potentially be better than others, art maintains its resistance to being subsumed by arthood. In this sense, there is something arthoodistic about Orwell's quote, which seems to anticipate and endorse the postmodern swamp of pluralism and subjectivism that characterises arthood, that in the absence of some form of objective measure of judgment, an aesthetic free-for-all is likely to reign. Whether it is true or demonstrably false that one can prove whether one particular artwork is better than any other or not, the possibility of somehow doing it might be enough to maintain a state of practice distinct from arthood and its corporatist capitalist logic of terminal growth. Ironically, arthood embraces through, for example, prizes and competition, what Terry Atkinson has dubbed the, quote, most rampant fundamental capitalist formulation, quote, end quote, while also indiscriminately appropriating words like exceptional, outstanding and original, which suggests some qualitative discrimination between the artwork in question and all other artworks. In contradistinction to art's clinging on to discriminating between artworks on the basis of quality, Gagosian's car boot sale collection of what presumably constitutes arthood, for example one of his Picassos, is undoubtedly equal to a Hearst, although it is difficult to shake off the suspicion that it is the Picasso making all the compromises, devaluing its own stock of symbolic capital to allow for an inflated significance of Hearst. The redistribution of the Picasso estate for the greater communistic and egalitarian good. This is, though, a corporatist capitalist form of egalitarianism. Everything is reduced to the same qualitative status, and the same qualitative status, one of everything, another of arthood's acquisitions associated with its presumption of historical continuity. Although in terms of exchange value the market determines, prices are highly differentiated based on whatever preferences, interests, etc. predominating at any given moment.
To reiterate, the aesthetic object is unstable in terms of potentially shifting between the conditions operative as art or as arthood. The general everyday use of art is effective and beyond reproach. In other words, it is irrefutably established within operations of the social formation of art, negating any sense of the interchangeability between the two conditions of art and arthood. It is the assurity that art objects constitute a clearly delineated and thoroughly established category of objects that either constitute art or do not, and that the defined status of art itself is unequivocally significant, meaningful and valid, and not in any rational way open to criticism or refutation. The critical consideration, as it is enjoyed by a large middle-class public, necessitates the use of the term arthood to indicate the production of art, or rather aesthetic objects, in conditions of this particular capitalist social formation, and the use of the term art with the ashgrapheme is consequently necessary to indicate a distinct way in which art is reduced to function specifically in relation to the irreversible imposition of the paradigm shift that arthood constitutes. Put succinctly, there is a distinction between art, essentially historical activity, and the activity in the current cultural conditions, which we term arthood. And the notion of a trace of what historically was art, a trace essentially in the form of an historical continuity, is assured to be still active in arthood, because it is required for arthood to raise itself above the status of mere commodity status, which is here referred to as art with the ashgrapheme.
Art may make incursions into the real world, covertly penetrate society and become diffuse. The design of things around us are determined by art in this general indirect way, as are the relationships we have with these objects. But this is not a form of direct engagement of art's operations enacted socially. One could take a conspicuously material object of a public sculpture, an artist's work situated on a roundabout, etc. How could this not constitute an example of art operative in a social context? But our point is the thing is no longer art, or we would argue it never was, as its conception could only have been brought about through relations of distribution inherently tied to the object as arthood. The local authorities allotted budget for culture, lottery funding, etc. Instantly ties the object to a set of administrative relations orchestrated on behalf of one of the art system's institutional alliances, of institutional determination of the work specifically in terms of public sculpture. There may be some vestige of art as opposed to arthood latent in its consumption, but this is little more than the associations inherent in the word art, and therefore the assumption of the thing as inhabiting not only a roundabout physically, but also metaphysically. The domination of the special province of objects that allow for the self-declarative identification of things as art.
The aesthetic object may not contain any particular presumption of art. An object can be considered aesthetic without necessarily constituting art, but the art object, i.e. the work of art, heavily, pretty much categorically, implies a presumption of art. If one tries to consider an art object that constitutes pure art, as it were, i.e. not arthood, the idea of some Robinson Crusoe produced artwork comes to mind. To achieve this, one would not be able to know the artwork, even anecdotally, at least not know the artwork as an artwork produced entirely autonomously with no knowledge of a local or wide institution or system of art, an ideological apparatus, etc. Of course, this artwork logically implies no need for specific training or education, at least in terms as we know education now, although not meaning as an impenetrable gated communities, security firms, pepper spray, or being battered round the head for attempting to hold the institution's management and bureaucrats to moral account, but rather the imposition of a theoretical structure on art-making practices. The figurative Paleolithic cave art in Chauvet-Pont d'Arc could be seen in these terms, at least prior to their discovery in 1994. Their discovery presumably initiating the automatic subsumption into the historical canon of European artistic production, and so inevitably headlong into arthood. For an artwork to be identified as pure art and liberated from any trace of arthood would instantly negate its identification. The notion of the production of an artwork that is deliberately sequestered from any contact with relations of distribution, and therefore circumventing arthood, has cropped up several times for us as a point of possible inquiry. The idea that retaining the work in storage and ad infinitum would allow the work to avoid any subsumption into the relations of distribution of arthood. Problematically, the artwork, for it to be an artwork, is produced with, and therefore predetermined by, the knowledge of the system of art, both its relations of production and its relations of distribution, the very same which supply the artist with this knowledge. The artwork is always produced in some artward corresponding shaped whole, even though it may never get to realise itself as one of innumerable similarly shaped artworks by filling it. The proposal of sequestering an artwork in a state of perpetual storage fails. The mere knowledge of a system, the system in which the knowledge is formulated, the knowledge of an institutional apparatus of production and distribution, immediately negates a priori any possibility of an artwork being sequestered from it. In a Robinson Crusoe situation of artistic or ethereal ignorance of any knowledge of the system of art, the artwork, or what would essentially constitute a neutral object, wrongly inferred to be unadulterated art, could indeed be sequestered, but it could not constitute art. It cannot be considered as an object of art without the knowledge of what it is not adulterated by, i.e. arthood. It might, in Mukarovsky's terms, constitute an aesthetic object but it cannot constitute an art object, artwork or work of art, etc. This has significance for any art practice now that sought to distinguish itself or its output from the art system, from arthood. If a means of producing art could be found distinct from arthood, then the outcome of such production could not be considered art in any meaningful operative sense. A successful repudiation of arthood could only be initiated by a knowledge of what the attempt of a repudiation was aimed at, knowledge which immediately necessitates a negation of art and arthood being mutually exclusive, and a consequent instantaneous affirmation of arthood. Any form of work produced, even if intended as critical of the social formation in which it is produced, is confirmatory of the same social formation and therefore inherently uncritical.
In more abstract terms, the following feels like a fragile argument, but nevertheless, some knowledge of a thing prefigures the potential of its negation. The knowledge of an alternative to what is negated, or a knowledge of a state that preceded the negated thing to be returned to, subsumes the alternative in the sphere of the negated thing, i.e. the negated thing is merely reproduced. In this sense, some a priori knowledge is required for the thing's production in those particular terms, but something must differentiate an artwork that is indefinitely sequestered from what it would be should it be unfortunate enough to meet the potential relations of its distribution, or otherwise its status would be that of the potato peeler lost down the back of a cutlery drawer. If a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody around to hear, does it make a sound? Does it make a sound? Somehow the artwork, or rather the aesthetic object, maintains a conceptual independence from society that differentiates it from ordinary objects, commodities, etc. What differentiates the thing as not like a potato peeler is art, and the negation of that differentiation renders the thing stated as something specifically other than art. The status of the potato peeler as other than art, though is always contingent on its avoidance of the conditions that, on being rediscovered, could potentially initiate its transformation as an art object. If a potato peeler falls down the back of a cutlery drawer, could it be art?
Conversely, the notion of the existence of an artwork that consists of unadulterated arthood, a no art evident whatsoever, who's equally difficult, it is tempting to assume that many artworks have reached this status. For example, the artistic contents of the Frieze Art Fair tent can't be far off. But by way of an example, which not only seems to exist entirely on the term of arthood, it is also offensively opportunistic in its production and consumption, is British artist Mark Quinn and Jen Reid's A Surge of Power of 2020. The somewhat rearguard action of giving the subject of a representational work shared authority, the complicated notion that the subject of the artist's representational artwork is also authored by the subject of the representation. Van Gogh's sunflowers, presumably following the logic, the specific actual once existing sunflowers could be allocated shared authorship. This work stands out as a particularly good example of an artwork having enacted a potentially complete dissolution of its status as art and derogated itself as a work of total arthood, a Gesamtkunstwerk. What is notable about the work is the direct, close correlation between the work's relation of production and its relation of distribution. Not simply that the thing was produced in a frantic, clamouring frenzy of production in order to capitalise the more effectively of the fullest possible opportunity for artistic exposure, but the work's relations of production are indistinguishable from its relations of distribution. The work's production is in fact embedded in its distribution. Even the sorry bric-a-brac of assorted commodities hauled into the Frieze tent could claim some distance between their production and their subsequent homes under the hammer-style flogging off. But the complete commitment to free market capitalism that facilitates the bile-inducing spectacle of the art fair industry must be based on something other than the business consumerist ideological apparatus that allows art fairs, such as frieze, to reproduce themselves. Clearly, this thing is the identification of the status of art, even if that status is in fact hardly identifiable amidst the booths of cultural commodities within the art fair annual season at only traced quantities. The material evidence of the status of art being extant is really the proliferation of the word art and the inherent connotations that the word initiates, essentially not much more than a derivative nomenclature. In excessive supermarket-like forms of distribution such as these, there is clearly a surfeit of arthood and a dearth of art. The significance of the connection of the word art for artworks such as Quin's and Reed's is that its association with the notion of an art historical continuity from none other than the caves of Chauvet-Pont-d'Arc are all the way to the forms of production contemporaneous with Quin. The connection between the current output of artist production and the assumption of these historical progenitors. Essentially, Quin and Reed's work is art because the word art connects it to an historical canon of previous output in being classified as maintaining the same status. Questions of quality are not enacted by the association, but the validity of the status of art with the ashgrapheme is impenetrably fixed as an insurance of cultural permanence. The vague and qualified identification of belonging to the special provenance of production that constitutes art is enough to initiate the sphere of arthood, the entire institutional apparatus of the art system, self-describing, self-confirming closed social system. The association of an entirely concealed trace of art is perversely enough to initiate the almost entire expropriation of the possibility of art, the ashgrapheme, and fully fledged avowal of arthood.
Current art's justification for inhabiting a special province of production and consumption is that it maintains a historical continuity, that it is in some special esoteric way like, or rather essentially the same as, the art of the past. At the same time, examples of past art are not exactly located in the same province, in the sense that they are incontrovertibly established as art. Their status is not particularly up for question. Although Nelson Goodman's question as to whether a Rembrandt removed from its stretcher bars and used to block up a broken window is operative as a makeshift draft excluder and not art, is answered only if Goodman's broader question, when is art, is answered first. The question may not necessarily be applicable to arthood. We consider earlier art such as the Rembrandt in terms of their material, often highly skilled, potentially evocative properties, even though the special province of contemporary art is conjured up from an association with past art and is in fact contingent on it. It is relying on a property of the association rather than the associated examples themselves. Arthood doesn't have a tendency to encircle examples of past art, as their status is conspicuously distinguishable from reproducing, self-affirming relations of production and consumption. When past art is subjected to current relations of distribution, for example some institutional, artistic or curatorial, or an unpleasantly hubristic amalgam of all three, a breaking of the boundaries, recontextualization, past art's subsumption into arthood manifests itself more conspicuously.
Terms such as aesthetic object and creative or artistic imagination or expression are given affirmations that appear to prevail and propagate themselves with the sole purpose of negating any consideration of an art practice's art output as constituting mere commodities. Although proliferation of such terms is responsible for initiating the privileging of artworks as special types of commodities, again, the identification of this instrumentality being art itself, this consideration of art maintaining a specificity or particularity or peculiarity of the aesthetic object, follows Lukács, who sought to distance art as distinct from both practical and mysterious or esoteric entities. Practical is associated with the alienated outcomes as existing in capitalism, which is usually subscribed as a real condition, and which art would be viewed as a negation of. But art, for Lukács, should also be distanced from the mystical, of art as occupying an esoteric special province of activity, whereas an ideology itself, art serves up output from within a closed, self-describing system or social formation.
The issue of subjectivity that the closed, self-defining system of art propagates quite effortlessly, of artistic intention formulated by other pre-existent artistic intentions within the system, creates difficulties. It is the subjective nature of art when it comes into contact with, or when attempts are made to integrate it into a consideration of wider material social processes, that initiates those difficulties. Not just the social conditions of making art, which the artistic intention might attempt to ignore, but with a general social process that cannot be ignored. A social process that is permanent in the processes of both making and consuming art that constitute material processes within a specific social formation. Formalism exposed this difficulty, which Mukarovsky's later structuralist social functionalist text, Aesthetic Function, sought to engage with. Both art objects and non-art objects can constitute, through their specific organisation, objects that are intended to have an aesthetic purpose. Quote, "This is actually the essential property of art, but an active capacity for the aesthetic function is not a real property of an object, even if the object has been deliberately composed with the aesthetic function in mind. Rather, the aesthetic function manifests itself only under certain conditions, i.e. in a certain social context." For Mukarovsky, end quote, for Mukarovsky, art does not inhabit a special esoteric province, but rather a place where the aesthetic function coalesces with other social functions and remains dominant. Bourgeois categories of impermeable aesthetic qualities can be dismissed as historically and socially orchestrated. Art as a categorically separate dimension is abandoned in favour of a relative form of social cultural practice. This risks returning to a full-blown postmodern theories of an art that rejects itself, that aesthetics is the problem, not the solution, that the problem of art is art itself, meaning what is required as a solution is a form of art that isn't art, which may be easier to write than to do. Mukarovsky shows the limiting properties of the bourgeois categories of art, aesthetic, etc., and the subsequent dissolution into a multiplicity of cultural practices. The ideology exposed in separating the categories of art and non-art constitute a version of a division of labour, of raising art as distinct from ordinary production of commodities. In contradistinction, art is seen, in fact, as not having been socially and materially produced at all, but rather as having been created, or of having emerged out of some indistinguishable activity. The abstracting, limiting definition of art as aesthetic is, quote, so powerful that in its name we find ways of negating or of dismissing as peripheral that relentless transformation of artworks into commodities within the dominant forms of capitalist society, end quote from Raymond Williams. What results is an approach to and a defence of the sphere of art that sees it as not socially or materially or economically determined, but as inherently distinct and reified, as a form of welcome relief from the real world, i.e. as useless.
Art constitutes a form of production that depends upon a perception of being distinct from capitalist production of commodities, as exempt from and made exceptional to what productive work has been made to mean in relation to artistic work. The definition of what this perception is constitutes the purpose of this present text. Art requires for its continual reproduction to be separated by abstraction from the social processes in which it in actual fact is produced, and remains embedded. Aesthetic theory initiates this obfuscation and evasion. It focuses on interpretation, produces a division of labour of the consumption of art that echoes a division of labour of its production as distinct from commodity production or manual work. This relates to the shift in meaning in the use of the word art with the ash grapheme as opposed to art, as constituting a trace of an erstwhile art in the form of an art historical continuity operative in the sphere of arthood. Its work, occasions and institutions, what Proudhon referred to as a fantasy of our mind for a mental disposition and the natural organ of success and the protector of the struggling, i.e. the dominant cultural forms of art's material processes.
Bukowski's use of aesthetic function constitutes a series of situations or occasions. A dominant defining aspect of these situations or occasions is the production of work that is specifically produced for these situations or occasions. This is an indication of a social system reaching the level of operational closure and developing an ability of self-description. At this stage, categories of art and aesthetic become redundant, as do attempts at qualitative discrimination. What matters are categories of dominant, prioritised, successful, etc., and their attendant antonyms of subordinate, ignored, failed, which have more to do with class domination and privilege than aesthetic properties. What distinguishes examples of successful art from failed art has very little, if anything at all, to do with aesthetic qualitative discriminations. As the art system can be at least partly defined as a system where production is carried out or occasioned for specific situations, then the domination of those situations by a specific class, a privileged capitalist class, constitutes the purpose of artistic production. Other discussions to do with fetishized qualities constitute meaningless bourgeois distractions from the problem. Although reducing this distraction to a binary opposition between all art is exclusively aesthetic or all art is exclusively an ideology comes down to interpreting art in terms of either formal values and meanings or of social and political meanings and values, or to a more complicated combination of both. The dominant focus on aesthetic properties of art is an emphasis weighted towards the material properties of art. This is the case even if earlier associations of materials or the medium of a work of art with higher levels of skill exposed the fact that this emphasis may not have been enough to distinguish art's output from everyday manual work or capitalist production. Thus a more idealised, reified and nonsensical emphasis was required. Art as organically grown from a seed of genius out of pre-existent materials, to delineate a much clearer distinction between art and commodities and their association with capitalism and its structures of organised greed.
Lerman asks, how can a closed system that cannot operate in the environment be determined environmentally? Answer, by internalising the distinction between system and environment within the system itself. The system cannot operate in the environment, but it can use the distinction drawn between system and environment to guide and inform internal operations. The use of the distinction between system and environment is of the order of a contradiction. When Macharai asks, what do we see in the mirror, in relation to Lenin's description of Tolstoy as the mirror of the Russian Revolution, it is analogous to Lerman's paradoxical question regarding operational closure. How is it possible to transcend the boundaries without transcending them, to produce openness by closure?
According to Luhmann, the system is able to internalise the distinction between internal and external, to use the distinction of system and environment within the system. The system cannot operate in the environment, but it can use the distinction. That the distinction itself is contained within the system to guide internal operations. From this point of view, what art consists of is a process system of drawn distinctions continuously re-entering the system. If we want to revert back from Goodman's question, when is art, if attempts to answer the question, what is art, characteristically end in frustration and confusion, perhaps, as so often in philosophy, the question is the wrong one. The real question is not what objects are permanently works of art, but when is an object a work of art? And return to the original question it replaced, i.e., what is art? The answer, in light of the foregoing, is art is a system of re-entry, of distinctions re-entering their own system.
Are distinctions transformatory? The artist produces a distinction between some examples of output and the environment or social formation in which the output's production is determined, and the system, at the point of the distinction between artwork and the art world, for example, immediately internalises the distinction. The distinction re-enters the system-environment distinction. Thus, art cannot operate beyond the boundaries of the system. Without the initial distinction perpetrated by the artist, one cannot make a claim to art. For example, without the distinction between system, artwork, and environment, art world, the ready-made would remain the thing it was in its original provenance prior to its declaration and entry into the special province, production of the distinction, as an object ambivalent to the art system. Essentially, the distinction re-enters the distinguished. How can art, or rather using the neologism, how do you say that? Neologism, arthood, if it constitutes a closed system with which it is not capable of operating beyond its own system boundaries in the environment, reference objects from the environment.
Don't know what it means.
You're going to read the red bits?
I was going to, yeah. There's eight short notes that we maybe need to elaborate on elsewhere. 1. How does a system deal with the distinction? 2. What kind of operations does art consist of, which includes internal and external reference? 3. Communication in art is a distinction. The system closes on this basis. 4. How do operations function within the art system? 5. Can we distinguish which functions operate within the art system and which don't? 6. Function is inadequate, insufficient to define specific art operations. 7. The use of binary oppositions such as art, non-art, in order to distinguish and discriminate. And finally, 8. Definition of what is meant by function or functionalism.
Word is neologism.
Neologism.
Functionalism alone is not sufficient to identify and define what operates within the specific system of art. It is inadequate in answering how operations function within the art system. It doesn't help us to differentiate what functions operate within the art system and which don't, as it is conceivable that something with the same function or functionality could operate in a sphere separate from the art system. The function alone is clearly not enough to make a distinction between the system and the environment. As function is inadequate to define specific art system operations, the use of binary oppositions is necessary to help discriminate between the system and the environment. For example, the use art, non-art, or art, arthood. Does this conversation constitute art? Draws a distinction between the art system and the environment. Will this artwork appreciating value operates predominantly in an economic system distinct from art?
In addition to the use of function and binary oppositions to discuss the art system, another consideration is required. This is the consideration of the actual state of the system, its content. If you make a distinction such as good, less good, without some means of discriminating against some value, it proves irredeemably abstract. Without some consideration of the content of the system, how could one attribute value and discriminate between good and less good? This allows for the notion that there is a continual reference to the actual state of the system itself throughout the process initiated by the initial drawing of the distinction between the system and environment. It is inherently present, for example, in the sentence "this is art," which immediately calls itself into question. The distinction of good, less good, inserted as in "this is good art," renders the sentence equally meaningless, but the question as to whether it is in fact art, let alone good art, seems deferred. The distinction good, less good, without a consideration of the actual state of the system, is totally interchangeable. As with certain examples of postmodernism, it would require equivocal that it would remain equivocal that what is good is potentially equally less good, and vice versa.
To operate within the system, participants must know the actual state of the system, the rules in order to function effectively within the system's terms. What they know of the actual state of the system is, as ever, an ideological version of the actual state of the system, mediated by the making of the distinction between system and environment. Three factors contribute: function, binary opposition, and the recursive referencing to the system that has and will continue to reproduce the system indefinitely.
And here's a handful of short notes as yet unexplored. 1. The system is normatively closed and cognitively open. 2. How does the system deal with references internally and externally? 3. Normatively closed, only norms specifically within the terms of the art system matter, cognitively open. And 4. 4. The language of art can only be used within the system of art. 5. I know that the artist and the art lover spontaneously express themselves in terms of creation, etc. It is a spontaneous language, but we know from Marx and Lenin that every spontaneous language is an ideological language, the vehicle of an ideology. Here the ideology of art and of the activity productive of aesthetic effects. That was a quote from Althusser from a letter on art. 6. Art's relation to its distribution, or the art system's relation to its environment, can be seen in the sentence "if someone comprehends another artwork," the operative word being another. 7. It is permitted at the exclusion of the rest of the environment. I think that's a continuation of the same note. It is permitted at the exclusion of the rest of the environment.
A system that constructs its own operations, that reproduces itself, such as the art system, is continually engaged in concepts and interests, variously weighted roughly equally or in favour of one or the other, sometimes to the point of entirely excluding the other, but never entirely eliminating the other. Both are always at play, as the individual domination of one requires the conspicuous implied exclusion of the other. Concepts engage at the internal level within the limited environment, whereas interests engage within or initiated externally within a wider environment, such as the social formation like the art world. An artist succeeds in the unlikely possibility of not engaging in interests, some sort of Robinson Crusoe tabula rasa artist, whose output could be said to engage only in concepts, spitting chewed up berries over a hand positioned on a rock surface as a concept, has not achieved operational closure. They do not, as yet, function within a closed system. It would require an engagement in interests to fulfill the all-encompassing seal of operational closure, such as, ironically, an opportunity to exhibit on a newly discovered neighbouring island.
And then 2 more notes. The general approach Lenin takes is that artworks that only make sense if considered in relation to a determinate historical period, and that Tolstoy, like all artists, produced an incomplete picture of reality. And then another short note: our practices provisional and intermediate quality.
The situation of artists, as well as their states of mind, is contradictory. At the point of distribution, of which their relations of production are now firmly embedded, they find themselves within the sphere of the capitalist class, although their struggle against commodification is invariably a struggle for the production of distinct objects that negate capital, to produce exceptional objects. Such an object that at the point of its distinction re-enters the distinguished. The position of artist operative within the realm of arthood is one of collusion dependent upon a contradiction. The artist is present in reality primarily at the point of production by the manifestation of their absence. The material development and assertion of power is obscured for them. The artwork's presence is less important than the fact that it is elaborated by all the conditions that have determined its presence.
Each ideology is shaped by the pressures upon the class which generates it. Artists' relation to reality, as it is currently manifested, is not directly determined by the artist's individual position. Rather, their relation to reality is oblique, mediated by a specific ideology. Ideology being the common term which connects the artist's position in relation to reality and their representations of it. Artists' output must be considered from two points of view. From the point of view of the current reality and from the point of view of the ideological version of that reality. Ideology is encountered in artists' work only to the extent that artists encounter the ideology. Artists don't construct ideologies but merely perpetrate them in their output. To make an artwork out of an ideology would require the existence of a definition of a non-ideological artwork. An artwork that claims to have abandoned ideology is merely the perpetuation of an existing ideology.
The artwork constitutes an ideology not only by perpetuating existing ideologies, but also in its being elaborated as a specific form, as an artwork. Its form is that of artistic authority and self-confirming validity. The output of the artist is a self-affirming centre of validity, utilised as a criterion of qualitative judgment and tied to an uninterrupted art historical continuity that constitutes its primary ideology. It's art because the artist says it is. It is good art because the institution says it is. Criticism is equally affirmed by the institution, the system of art, etc. All criticism can do is inadequately respond with bourgeois ideological concepts, the critical tradition of what Lenin called the deceptions of reactionary and liberal criticism.
In its relation to reality, the best any given artwork can achieve is to constitute a contradiction. There can be no mechanical correspondence, no representation between the artwork and some aspect of reality it may refer to. The relation between an artwork and any reality by way of external reference is one of contradiction. As to what the thing referenced from reality is, if it does not constitute reality, it must be something to do with contradiction. A representation of something, ideology, it fails to represent. Referencing things does not reproduce things. This would require some form of mechanical correspondence. The reference is deceptive and allows only for contradictory relationships. It evokes contradictory relationships of what things are referred to. What in art gets confused with meaning? This apparent meaning is determined externally of the system. It allows us to say the artwork is expressive, that it is expressing what is referenced. The artwork is then defined by its relation to something else, something other than itself. The artwork is defined by its lack of or its incompleteness in relation to what it refers to. Through art we can come across something we already know, else it would not be a reference. The reference could be interior or exterior in the sense of both ideology or more simply self-reference. We are now aware the artwork operates on the basis of it introducing to itself an external referent that precipitates an internal contradiction. The use of Luhrmann's terminology to see if it sticks. The artwork cannot. To use Luhrmann's terminology to see if it sticks, the artwork cannot operate beyond the boundaries of the system within which and by which it is described. Taken collectively, artworks represent only the historical contradiction from which they are determined, of which they cohere with only on the basis of being an ideological version of. This would explicitly be the case with a ready-made, declarative in production or exhibited in distribution. What counts is the distinction between What counts is the distinction made which requires for its internalisation an understanding of its function, its binary opposition, the condition of the system. The artwork can only be defined within the terms of contradiction because it can only simultaneously fail to refer to reality while referencing reality. This involves the system infiltrating, expanding temporarily into the environment in the form of something along the lines of structural coupling to tie the system to the real reference in order for the system to produce its ideological version of the reality referenced.
From the point of view of the environment or real world, the artwork is lacking and incomplete. From the point of view of the art system in which it is determined, it is complete, in that it is adequate for its meaning, in its use of the reference. The two foregoing sentences don't contradict one another if they're understood as an extension of each other, as representing a foray into the system by the system into the environment. The artwork may well be expressive in its failure to adequately reproduce the reference.
Because the artwork is defined by the contradictory conditions in which it is determined, it constitutes both a reference, internal, and a failure to reference, external. This is why artworks are internally contradictory, not because they reflect social contradictions. If they do, or at least attempt to, they would merely constitute inadequate references as a result of failing to reproduce social contradictions, a consequence of a failure to reproduce. There is no mechanical correspondence of reproducing something of the real world environment within its own system and what it references. Expression does not cohere automatically with attempting to reproduce something. All that is achieved is reference of ideological versions.
A dialectic in art, if such a thing might possibly exist, such as translated from a dialectical theatre, will come about between the artwork and the dialectic of the real world, social formation, environment, etc. Contradictions within the artwork or the art world system are themselves merely a consequence of the real dialectical contradictions. Thus, contradiction within the sphere of art cannot be real. Art can only constitute ideology as it is the product of real operative social contradictions, although they are elaborated dialectically, which involves the entire apparatus of the system of art, the social formation of the art world. This determination of the artwork by the wider social formation is almost the only direct relationship the artwork engages with in the real world, excepting reference, already mentioned, which could be defined as the artwork's failure to operate beyond the boundaries of the system that reproduces it.
Ideology is the false answer to real questions. Implicitly, an artwork as constituting an ideology constitutes an exposure of ideology, or at least to a definition of it. Thus, the absurdity of all attempts to demystify artworks, which are defined precisely by their enterprise of mystification. That art constitutes an ideology implies that it is used or functions ideologically as one of the means by which the dominant class of a social formation maintains its dominance. Whatever art does in fact present, if it constitutes an ideology, it must do it according to the most dominant ideologies, everything it shows being mediated by the dominant ideology as a form of representation. Art cannot present any substantive reality, only an ideological representation of that given reality. Art, therefore, comes predefined, constrained within predescribing, predetermined limits that are integrated so thoroughly in a hegemonic sense by the dominant ideology as to appear entirely organic and rational in its ever-reproducing originality to almost all artists and art's assorted celebrants within the parameters of the system. Weirdly, this includes those that the dominant ideology of art entirely ignores. In fact, it is by the conditions of consent offered by those ignored, failed and irrelevant artists in the institution's terms that the dominant ideology is elaborated, perpetuated and secured to a level resembling normality. A confirmation of the appearance of art's ability to present or reflect reality revealingly straight back at us. The hierarchical system of art is taken as a default point of departure for people embedded within the system who are not artists, such as the stratum of administrators, curators, managers, functionaries, etc., who share in the remuneration generated by the apparatus of the art system. Those people who are economically committed to preserving the persistence of the system are predominantly near the exploited, but close enough to the exploiter to feel included, perilously dogged by leadership initiatives. Meanwhile, artists go on believing that the apparatus is concerned only with the presentation and distribution of their work and is in fact merely a peripheral necessity that has no determining agency when it comes to their work, as it merely facilitates opportunities for its consumption. Weirdly, artists defer to the stratum of administration as being best suited to select what examples of art attain the requisite qualitative level of distribution, and that their authors are subsequently permitted to benefit from its attendant notions of success. But also, by implication, the stratum of administrators selects which artists fall pathetically short, with that latter decision's attendant notions of failure. The separation of artwork into two principal categories of good and bad is done on the institution's authority.
Artists, whether successful or entirely failed, although somewhere in between, that manage to sustain just enough momentum from the scraps of bait tossed from them intermittently from above, the odd group show here, the odd day's teaching there, not least those who comically consider themselves avant-garde, do not think of challenging or changing the apparatus of the system of art, because they believe the apparatus is at their disposal to distribute whatever they freely dream up, transforming itself intuitively to facilitate their most radical ideas. But their free, autonomous output is entirely disposable. The apparatus goes on irrespective of them, fulfilling its purpose with or without them. Galleries, museums, art publications, etc. carry on absorbing what they require from an ever-present surplus of eager practitioners. All the apparatus requires is a given amount of stuff. If a given artist stands any chance of attaining success, they must yield compliantly to the apparatus. The stratum of administrators similarly are completely dependent on the apparatus in terms of their social and economic formation. For them, the apparatus constitutes the only possible means of realising their work. The stratum of administrators is not too distinct from artists in this sense. The output of an artist's practices looks, in its pluralist appearance, nothing if not like material to be organised, validated or realised by the apparatus.
It might be expected that the acknowledgement that the system of art's imposition on the production of art, that it subjugates the relations of production to such an extent that the production of a work that is unfettered by the system in which it is produced is rendered at best unlikely, would consequently result in a total overthrow of the system. That this isn't the case, that on the contrary the opposite is enacted, of limitation, selectivity, the construction of impenetrable hierarchical infrastructures contributing to the system's growth, is what elaborates arthood. Arthood emerges as a result of an ambivalence to a hostile system that relies for its reproduction on the civility of the majority of its trampled adherents. The means of production do not belong to the artist as producer, and as a result the artist's work amounts to so much merchandise. The output of arthood is merchandise manufactured by the apparatus of the system of art.
The stratum of administrators constitutes a category of functionaries of the creative industries through their close-knit association with artists, as a kind of culturally alert administrative extension of artists, sharing the latter's cultural capital or status of uninterrupted art historical continuity, which is no more clearly justified for themselves as it is for the artists they parasitically consume. Nevertheless, this association or qualification of an uninterrupted art historical continuity allows them to present themselves as similarly autonomous and independent of the dominant culture, as alternative or oppositional. By assimilating, by association, the artist naturally endowed status of constituting an exceptional producer of exceptional objects. The stratum of administrators appear insidiously as almost oppositional to the dominant culture, as if they do not constitute a wholly incorporated part of the ideological state apparatus. Nouns such as curator, facilitator, coordinator, even artist in some particularly offensive cases, comes to obfuscate the real or really overtly pernicious nouns such as asset manager, investment manager, dealer, gallerist, art director, etc.
This illegitimate, in the sense of remaining unsubstantiated, lacking validation, not corresponding to any identifiable truth as considered by Gramsci as cohering with revolution, assumed association of the social complex of the apparatus of the art system is tied to idealism, of artists thinking their own redescription, artists thinking themselves distinct from other social groupings and considering themselves somehow endowed with an exclusive, primordial, natural and innate faculty of free production. Artists' unlimited ability to disregard their material existence as enabling their thinking is only matched by their infinite capacity for self-delusion. By association, the stratum of administrators considers itself a part of a social utopian formation, an extension of the objects they exist to marketize, point blank refusing to be categorized as commodities. This stratum also similarly categorizes itself as independent, autonomous, endowed with a creative character all of its own, embedded as they are within the creative industries. If the stratum of administrators sees itself hierarchically linked to artists, situated above the failed and equally to or surrounding the successful, depending on the various levels of integration into capitalism, artists see themselves hierarchically linked to the sacrament that is the exceptional, wholly distinct art object that is simply incapable of falling into the depths of commodification, the commodity that can only at best strike the heel of the exceptionalist artwork.
The point is that the current conditions of artistic production are secured not through any overt imposition or coercion, but by a consensually insidious proliferation and elaboration of the logic that all artists produce freely, that their work consists of interior expressions of exterior realities made exterior, that all art is valid and important. In some sense, all art is valid and important, at least to someone. But the system of art within its upper echelons bleats this sentimentalism, whilst also only promoting the slickest marketable variants and condemning any deviation as Philistinism. In this sense, art's production, at least, is equitable, democratic, etc., even if it never sees the light of day beyond the spare room cum studio walls. Art as an ideology is most efficient when it supplies artists with a sense that art world failure doesn't actually constitute failure at the individual level. This, coupled with the institution's dangling of bait in the form of some indeterminate potential public success, is what constitutes the current apparatus of art's dominance.
Art is seen disingenuously as being somehow distinct or exceptionally detached from such real determinants as private property, greed, competition, etc., and that these apparently inconsequential and peripheral real-world circumstances are just the base out of which the inevitable superstructural expression of the necessary course of the development of art emerges. By simply being in the world, art supposedly partially engages with such real-life determinants, but in its essence is unencumbered by this. But private property, greed and competition are clearly well-established characteristics of the art world. In art's weirdest and most deluded manifestations, it is not uncommon that art itself is considered to be detached from the art world, that it is clearly an unavoidable part of. The art world being considered by artists as something that somewhat unfortunately happens over there, that is of no significance over here in the sanctity of the studio.
This perception or self-deception, bordering on a full-blown Stockholm syndrome of art and its world, is merely a manifestation of artist production as abstracted and alienated from its own output, and deluded to the point of an inability to comprehend its output for what it really is. This form of abstracted artistic production that constitutes full-blown arthood is really art produced simply for the purposes of the system in which it is produced. Abstracted autotelic production that represents the output of the artist's production as alienated from them and what they set out to do, how they intend to live their lives as artists.
Some examples of art are situated hierarchically, variously closer or further away.
It's a big truck.
Yeah.
Should
we only have one?
I don't think it's going to get out, is it? That's right.
Some examples of art are situated hierarchically, variously closer or further away within the superstructure in relation to the base. The reasons for their positioning is not connected to their appearance or something along the lines of their content that qualitatively somehow might be exchanged for survivability, but rather the specific relations of their production, such as authorship as a measure, here exposure and quality are mutually synchronous. If as Orwell has it, survival is the only test of artistic merit, then it is very conspicuously not an index to majority opinion, but on the contrary, minority opinion of a few privileged artists and functionaries of the institution. Where an artwork is situated in relation to the economic base is dependent on just how far the artist engages with arthood, with the relations of distribution. As the Orwell quote identifies it is also related to success, as it is defined by the system of art itself, as measured by survival, itself an index to majority opinion. But clearly it is not the so-called majority opinion that is of any significance within the system of art, which in fact is notorious for the trope of its elite status as distinct in relation to its alienation, well beyond the concerns of majority opinion, but simply where its most prominent forces of distribution are maintained. And this is always within a privileged, affluent class of owners, entrepreneurs, managers, directors, board members, creatives, etc.
The more the artist exerts themselves in the direction of the art world's definition of success, where the path forward bifurcates between success cum careerism and failure cum practice, and the way marked success cum careerism is inevitably opted for by majority, the more omnipotent and powerful becomes the sphere of practice the artist is alienated from, which they construct against themselves, the more their human nature and creativity is impoverished. The choice of success cum career is to opt for acquisitiveness, which results in an abstract form of output, and all senses are reduced to that of merely having, possessing, etc. Subsequently, the more depleted they and their initial intentions become, and the more inert the prospect of control and inner purpose becomes. The more success an artist achieves, the less of themselves they retain. The apparatus of the art system, which facilitates their success, becomes an obstacle to their output, particularly if it deviates from the specific course that constituted its success, which the apparatus defines as opposed to its aims. The artist's output then becomes a matter of delivering the goods. Artists produce within the predefined, preordained shape that fits the apparatus rather than forcing the apparatus to acquiesce to the emergent shape of the output. And here's a bit of Brecht for good measure. People say this or that is a good work, and they mean but do not say good for the apparatus. Yet this apparatus is conditioned by the society of the day and only accepts what can keep it going in that society. We are free to discuss any innovation which doesn't threaten its social function, to reproduce the apparatus, We are not free to discuss those which threaten to change its function. Society absorbs by the apparatus whatever it needs in order to reproduce itself. This means that an innovation will pass if it is calculated to rejuvenate existing society, but not if it is going to change it, irrespective of whether the form of the society in question is good or bad.
The artist puts themselves, their lives, into the practice, with the consequence that the output of their practice no longer belongs or particularly relates to them, but rather belongs to the output itself as an alien thing, as some sort of parasitic matrophagy in the form of the commodity. The more successful an artist becomes, the less they will recognise their own work, the more distance from it they become, to the point of looking upon the next studio exhibition as upon a room of estranged things.
The alienation of the artist from their own artwork means not only that their work becomes an external object rather than a practice from which they are alienated, but also that it functions and exists outside of them, independent and alien to them, an autonomous power that is hostile and opposed to them. Artists think they benefit from an apparatus which they consciously and deliberately hold at arm's length, but which in fact holds them at increasingly close quarters in an operative headlock. Problematically, this alienated form of social production is presented and widely, Orwell uses the word majority, makes more sense here, accepted as the essential, original and definitive form of production within the system of art. This constitutes the way art is produced in an advanced capitalist society, with the artist engaged in an ongoing conflict with their own output. It manifests itself as a binary choice between two approaches at the level of the individual artist to accept or at least tolerate the hostility of one's own artwork in relation to oneself as an artist, which constitutes the choice of maintaining an art career, or alternatively to proactively make the hostility between one's own artwork in relation to oneself as an artist the purpose of continuing to produce artistic output, which constitutes the choice of maintaining an art practice. This clear distinction between art career and art practice constitutes the balance of power between the social formation that is the art world, how it very one-sidedly bifurcates between a majority form of the productive forces and a minority opposition. As far as the social formation of the art system is concerned, the more success attained within the pursuit of an art career, the more subsumed and weakened the artist becomes in relation to production of their own work. And adversely, the more failure attained within the maintenance of an art practice, the more autonomous and ameliorated the artist becomes in relation to the production of their own work. As mentioned, the only way out of this binary cycle would be the production of an artwork that's realisation as an artwork is somehow produced as distinct from a commodity by the decision to not produce it in the first place. Although the question arises that if the realisation of an unrealised artwork was somehow realised, how long would it be before its inevitable subsumption into the art world's sclerotic embrace of the market and private property relations?
The notion of art as some form of free creative agency cannot be operatively meaningful, i.e. it is more likely that artists are somewhat manipulated, compliant beings as opposed to freely creative beings. If what artists produce are subject to forces and pressures that determine their consciousness, their ideas, the content and form of their work, etc., although the conditions that determine the work of art are conditions of alienation, the pressure of the determining base upon the determined infrastructure, artists are perceived as producing in supposedly free, self-determined creative isolation. In reality, artists' production is prefigured and predetermined by the promise of the infrastructure of the relations of distribution, a public display, exhibition, in the form of a dissolution of their own agency that is enacted as much in the promise of success as it is in the few privileged instances of actualization. The materialist take on history points to the fact that social formations are determined by forces that the participants of the social formation do not understand, and even if they did, are unable to influence in any operationally useful way, other than by the individual default of compliant affirmation, a delusional declaration of being an artist, and that these alien forces are in fact nothing but the productive forces of the participants of the social formation themselves, the accumulated collective force of individual artists maintaining an endless supply of failed clamouring practices, a surfeit of reserve of wealth of failure that intermittently offers up its demand in the form of a handful of successful artistic careers that perpetuate art's excessive inflation, as so many examples of private property, while simultaneously dangling the requisite bait of success before the parted, salivating lips of the surplus wealth of failure. Artists as the tinkling bell to the salivating jaws of one of Pavlov's dogs. Ultimately, artists contribute themselves in producing the productive forces that subjugate and control their individual production.
Thinking again about the system of art topographically in terms of determining economic base and a determined superstructure, the hope for an emancipated form of art production rests in the hope of the possibility of the potential of some residual resistance or counter-determination in the form of going against the dominant culture, in the form of a residual or emergent oppositional, not incorporated type, going in the direction of the superstructure through the relation of artist production back to the forces of production and the base. Although exactly how much counter-resistance or how many artists would have to swim against the current, and for how long in order to abrogate art and cut it from its umbilical cord of private property, is difficult to predict. It might be that there is some slim potential for an emancipated form of maintaining an art practice, or possibly our addiction has reached its full-blown dependency, but the possibility itself is what, for now, justifies the continuation of maintaining an art practice.
That is the end.
Yeah. Scare the cat.
Part 8, Orgreave. Does Jeremy Deller's Battle of Orgreave constitute a reflection of the events in Orgreave on the 18th of June 1984 in a comparable way to which Tolstoy's work constitutes a, to use Lenin's word, reflection of the Russian Revolution? Does the work constitute a degraded mirror reflecting nothing of the original event or only certain isolated aspects? Essentially, a mirror which does not reflect things correctly. Does Deller's Battle of Orgreave, as an battle object, constitute merely a bourgeois work of dreamy, diffuse and impotent lamentations? Or does it constitute a reflection of the events in Orgreave in the form of a panegyric, a representation of a socialist utopia built upon the affirmation of the artist Deller as a self-confirming centre of validity, structured on the institution's marketing material that he, Deller, knows right from wrong, or we, the nullified audience, are in no doubt that he knows right from wrong because he says so. The institution agrees. Is Deller to artists what Robert Owen was to the workers of New Harmony? Is his battle object synonymous with the Etruscan Lucumo's little bronze ship of death, placed beside the great chief's body to bear him over to the other world, part of the impedimentia of the important dead? After all, the funerary arts are always more or less commercial. The rich man orders his sarcophagus while he is still alive, and the monument carver makes the work more or less elaborate according to the price. D.H. Lawrence.
Art constitutes an ideology. In its earlier manifestations prior to the total mutation into arthood, it might have maintained a more benign quite particular and specific relationship with ideology, as opposed to constituting an ideology itself. Art's mutation into arthood, into fully fledged cooperative, more or less commercial relations of production, was concurrent with its constitution as an ideology. If an ideology can be defined as an imaginary representation of reality, it is difficult to maintain that art does not constitute an ideology. In this sense, art is aligned with Raymond Williams's three distinct definitions of ideology: a system of illusory beliefs, false beliefs or false consciousness, which can be contrasted with true or scientific knowledge. Art does not represent real conditions or the real world through its output, but rather what is represented through art is its relation to the real world. This situation corresponds to the learner's understanding of a closed system's means of communication with the environment beyond its own parameters as a form of re-entry for the system itself, recognising the distinction that its inception produces between the system and environment being reproductively brought back in, or as re-entering the system itself, resulting in a situation of art constituting a representation of its relationship with what it isn't and what it cannot directly affect. The nature of this representation is vacuously subjective and autotelic, i.e. it exists purely for its own existence. The relation between the artist and the real world is what art represents, in ideological or imaginary form. Its so-called creativity is a byproduct of its ideological status. What art offers is a distortion of the real world, which is a consequence of its own alienation from the real world. Defining art as an ideology is a step towards an emancipated form of art practice that is dialectically resistant to, or at least critical of, and aware of the realities of its subsumption into an ideological apparatus, operating on behalf of the reproduction of capitalist relations of production and exploitation. The apogee of art in the current conditions of production within a dominant form of culture rests in its use value for the capitalist class, which is reified by and alienated as exchange value, as opposed to the use value as beneficent of a society's diverse and inclusively distributed emergent or alternative culture. Put bluntly, Deller's Battle of Orgreave may constitute an impotent form of a commodity, and even possibly, who knows, a potent form of art, but its correspondence with the stuff of the same status that does sell and sell quickly contributes to the frictionless shifting of such stuff. It doesn't, and yet it could. Deller could position himself, and by extension his work, in opposition to this. The relation the Deller battle object has with the relations of its distribution are very particularly specific and chosen, even if knee-jerk and inadvertently solipsistic. The identification of art as an ideology, tasked with producing an imaginary distribution of the ideological representation of the real world, of false ideas, of false consciousness, leads us back to the system of art as constituting a closed, self-describing system. The art system is highly productive in the sense of the reproduction of its own boundaries, which result in its inability to engage in any substantive way with the real world, but merely to engage in a superficial way with its own relations with the real world. Everything is available for reference. Jeremy Deller's Battle of Orgreave is directly about the 1984 event in a literal way. Tolstoy, of course, is making the Napoleonic Wars into art in War and Peace, not a socialist revolution, so there's no question of any literal direct meaning. Where's that quote from?
I don't know. Doesn't seem like it would be, does it?
No.
Put a proper question mark next to that. Yeah. The system of art as it currently exists substantiates and justifies itself with reference to the swamp-like social formation in which it is formulated. The meaning of any given work is constructed constructed as an aggregate of associations that the work may or may not have intentionally referred to. The awkward silence of art school crits, broken only by utterances such as "it makes me think of ... it reminds me of ... it's a bit like this" or "it's a bit like that," etc. If art functions in terms of a relativistic totality of reference and association, this must logically include any unintended artistic references, as well as those references deliberately selected by the artist, presuming intentions unintended by an artist remain artistic by a sort of vague association with the authority of who didn't intend them. Or if it turns out that a meaning initiated by an artwork turns out to have been uninitiated by the artist, is that particular meaning refused artistic status on account of its degradation of artistic provenance. The Tate's website dilutes Derrida's deconstruction to a consideration of, quote, underlying and unspoken and implicit assumptions, end quote, implying a significant question arises in the face of the cause and effect relation vis-a-vis authorial intention and meaning. Quote, decentering the subject has been a main pathway down which deconstruction has beckoned. Fixed meanings of subjectivity itself have been questioned and unfixed. Meanings presumed to have their sole basis in nature have been unpinned from historical capitalist moorings, end quote from Terry Atkinson. This raises a consideration regarding what was/wasn't intended by the author as producer, which questions the legitimacy of the stereotype of absolute subjectivity on which the institution of art, down through its supply chain, the art market, the art education infrastructure, etc., is committed. Here there is an opportunity, obviously not for the Tate, to question the assumption of a subjectively inward authority and the attendant confessional autobiographical voice of artistic justification it encourages. The art system is divisible by its works of art, but not by any knowledge harboured within any individual work, on the understanding that artworks are not depositories of knowledge. Artworks cannot contain any knowledge that is constitutive or intrinsic to their status of being artwork. Knowledge operates externally to art objects, even when one encounters knowledge through art objects.
Jeremy Deller's The Battle of Orgreave is a clear example of art's referential nature. It constitutes an example of art that references with an epic impunity while asserting as affirmative the stereotype of absolutely authorial subjectivity that exposes its pure ideological function in terms of showing us only a limited, depleted relation between art and the real world. It references reality without supplying us with any knowledge of the real world. Clearly the work does use some appropriate knowledge from the real world, plain facts, small facts, what Tropsy called the foam on the surface of the historical torrent, but this is not in any way contingent on or intrinsic to the work's status being established as art. If the work is art, it is not art on the basis that it establishes an aggregate made by any knowledge it may use extraneously. The work may well constitute a sum of its parts, but those parts are not all constitutive of art. In fact, they can be distinguished, if perceived in terms of knowledge, by being appropriated knowledge, as ideology. The reference might be deliberate, but not constitutive of the work as artwork. Thus the reference is equal in status to an incidental or arbitrary reference, such as that the work could be engaged with on a Tuesday as opposed to on a Saturday, or before or after heavy lunch, etc. The work utilises a distortion of the real world, which is a consequence of its own alienation, specifically as an artwork from the real world. The work makes use of factual information, although its status as art in no way relies on the inclusion of factual information. Art in its current and teachable mutation, if it is to attain the status of art, is in no way dependent on reliable, unreliable, or, for that matter, false true information. Deller's Battle of Orgreave could substantively state that erroneously the real-world events in Orgreave it refers to and uses, one could say exploits, took place in spring 1986, 1 year after the defeat of the NUM. Note, could could substantively state only within the context of its status as an artwork. Erroneous information within the sphere of art can be as intentional as it can be valid, whereas obviously erroneous information within the sphere of the real world is invalid, or at least critically questioned by evidence of its falsity, or at least open to question in its state of verisimilitude. The definition of what constitutes truth is becoming increasingly deteriorated as we progress further into what the horror show of the 21st century. The sphere of art is self-insulated from any objective criterion of judgment, therefore. It is no reliable source of knowledge for anything at all beyond the parameters of its scope. Reliability only pertains to art in respect of its own reproduction. It is reliable source of information only for information of which it is the source.
Art in its earlier teachable forms relied on certain material or representational criteria for its validation in attaining its status. Painting depended on access to specific material means of production in addition to identifiable levels of correspondence between representation and represented, etc. These conventions were a part of what defined the object in which they were deployed as art. At some historical point, these established conventions became surplus to requirements, and the criterion for establishing the art object's defining elements became vague and widely diffuse. Current art may well hang on to such historically established conventions, but they are not required for attaining the status of art. They are used retrospectively as a means of validation. The Battle of Orgreave, as an artwork, therefore, supplies us with no knowledge of the real world. In this case, an example of police violence enabled by a corrupt state apparatus, in harmony with serving the interests of the political state apparatus, significantly facilitated by the collusion of ruling class compliant Fourth Estate, whose interests were equally embedded in the elite neoliberal capitalist class system. Looking at a work of art constitutes the opposite of knowing what the work of art supposedly opens up of the real world. We assume this is the point of Deller's work, that it opens up for the audience the events in 1984 in Orgreave within the context of contemporary institutional art. In fact, what the work refers to in the real world, the proclamation itself almost instantly rules out any access to knowledge of the thing referenced through the work of art. The viewer can only access the superficial appearance of the real world, i.e. the work. This is a distinction of some passive form of apprehending the artwork away from the pursuit of what is perceived, away from exploring the conditions that produced it. The reality referred to by the artwork is lost in the mediation as an artwork, but the conditions that cause the artwork, economic in the last instant, are potentially available to scrutiny. This is opposed to any assumption of accessing any knowledge of a work of art might allude to. We'll put to one side the understanding that with regard to the work of art, particularly in its fully formed ideological unteachable mutation, it may well constitute nothing whatsoever other than a superficial appearance. But the spectator in apprehending a work is restricted in knowing the conditions which determined it, or the reality distinct from the work, but which the work refers, sometimes directly to. Opportunistically quoting Debord, what the spectator gazes at in this scheme is the activity that has been stolen from him. It is his essence torn away from him, turned foreign to him, hostile to him, making for a collective world whose reality is nothing but man's own dispossession. End quote. In this sense, art is understood as illusory and capable only of promoting passivity with regard to the reality it obscures, the presentation of an illusory ideological version of some reality to an audience rendered passive. There is no doubt that Deller's work succeeds in reducing the events it references to the level of a bland representation in slightly more complicated ways, a commodity. Art then constitutes something that should be dismissed in favour of exactly what prompts the dismissed, i.e. the knowledge that the artwork obscures. One might reasonably argue, somewhere else, that the work produces an unhelpful pacifying effect of alienation such as one experiences in media representations. What knowledge is offered through the useful for the artwork artist art system inclusion of information is extraneous to the essential aspect of the work, specifically as an artwork. One might also argue, in defence of art, someone other than ourselves, that the work incorporates information or knowledge as a constitutive part of the artwork, resulting triumphantly in an artwork emboldened by a wider social political scope. But this would be crediting art with a function it is incapable of attaining. It is not possible to learn anything of the real world from art. If one learns something of the real world from art, it can only have been done in relation to something that is functioning as information, knowledge, etc., not as art as ideology. The artwork, Deleuze for example, can at best offer us an understanding of the relation between the ideology of art of which it is exclusively embedded and some aspect of the real world. It can show us how the artwork, which is determined and contingent on all-encompassing ideology, relates, as a specific example of its constitutive ideology, to the real world. If what knowledge is referenced in the artwork is not constitutive of the artwork as art, one can't help but wonder about the motivation for the reference, whether it constitutes a case of a cynical exploitation of subject matter for purely individual means, in the case of Deleuze displaying class consciousness in a comparable way to Boyce's use of felt, lard and coyotes, or possibly a case of an artist who happens to be interested in the subject matter and can't but help attempting to incorporate it into his careerist oeuvre. Deleuze has stated his interest in Orgreave as having been initiated by a sentimental memory of his childhood of watching television reports after school. Whatever the reasoning is, one has to question what purpose is being fulfilled by the work and its engagement in the relations of distribution in the cultural ideological apparatus. Does Deleuze's Battle of Orgreave, to quote Trotsky, place the struggle of the proletariat in the centre of its attention? The answer can only be, at the level of merely referencing a real-world event as a form of ideology, yes it does, but at the level of being operative in the real world, repercussions of the event, no it doesn't. It is inherently idealist rather than materialist. What seems to be absent from Deleuze's work, for all its aggrandizing exhibition of the aesthetics of socialism, is the Marxist conception of a materialist dialectics of the objective social dependence and social unity of art.
Utility.
Utility of art.
As stated, if we accepted the authorial intention reference to the events in Orgreave in early summer 1984 as contributing to the meaning of the Battle of Orgreave and as an artwork, we have to accept another authorial, including unintentional reference the work makes. Is the meaning of a work dominated by what its author claims to have meant, or is it possible the range of meaning of a given work might break beyond the signs manipulated by its author? The work is owned by the Tate, an institution with several connections with the corporate ideological apparatus. For example, the Battle of Orgreave forms part of the Art Angel collection in partnership with the Tate, who also exhibited the work at Tate Britain in 2015. According to the Tate's website, the institution's partnership with the French multinational bank BNP Paribas is anchored around shared values. Shared values presumably include Israel's matrix of control over the West Bank, including its consistent historical ambitions of a greater Israel by the erasure, by extermination or forced transfer of the indigenous Palestinian population, by annexation, settlement expansion, home demolition, ethnic cleansing, collective punishment, false imprisonment, limitations of water supply, etc. As the French multinational banking organisation maintains a substantial financial involvement in companies shoring up illegal Israeli residential, agricultural and industrial settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. The violent subjugation by an occupying, externally supported power of an occupied, dismantled, imprisoned, subjugated population. BNP Paribas also contributes finances to Elbit Systems, a UK manufacturer of bullets, drones, combat vehicles, electronic warfare system and missiles supplied for Israel's genocide assault on Gaza. At the time of writing, day 289 of Israel's genocidal assault. Here the work of art shows us again the relationship between the ideologies that determines the work and the actually existing real world.
In this sense, Deller's The Battle of Orgreave constitutes a representation of violence in at least two ways. First, literally, as an artist's use of events like paint in a reconstruction of events in Orgreave in 1984, and second, by the implied meaning of an unintended authorial reference to violence assumed and connoted within the relations of distribution after the paints dry and the painting declared completed, so to write. This particular work has some coherent relation with an historical precursor in the example of Guernica, as an example of a representation of violence. Guernica perhaps constitutes a bad choice from the point of view of our purposes, in that it sits in a sort of transitional modernist period with regard to the mutation from teachable to unteachable forms of art production, but its clear representation of an actual event, connection to earlier forms of conspicuously teachable art, the artist's earlier studies and related subject matter, Raft of Medusa, etc., and use of allegory positions it as preceding the shift, most obviously affirmed in the material form of the ready-made. The notion that Guernica could be considered a reconstruction would be at best questionable, primarily due to the use of representational devices associated with Cubism. It would only be considered in terms of being a representation or of representing the events of Guernica, which is that's the Basque spelling, in 1937. In terms of relating specifically to art. In these terms, Wyndham Lewis questioned the validity of art's ability to reference real-world events in a substantive way when he described Guernica as a big, highly intellectual poster, uninteresting in colour and having no relation to the political events that were supposed to provoke it. End quote. Nevertheless, there is a persistent distinction between, on the one side, an allegorical representation being teachable, and on the other, a literal reconstruction being unteachable. Deller's The Battle of Orgreave constitutes a reconstruction as an artwork within the context of arthood. It can only constitute a reconstruction as an artwork because of the shift in artistic production that manifests itself materially in output that cannot be taught in any reasonably substantive way. Obviously, one can maintain an art educational ideological apparatus around such output, but this is distinct from its output being actually teachable. All that can be done is to increase the apparatus in terms of complexity, distended theory, etc. Thus the work leads us again to consider its place in a period of artistic production that can be defined in terms of its unteachability. This is essentially what we would term arthood.
Does the work of art constitute a better or worse example of art with regard to its capacity to reference the real world? This question is asked specifically from within the context of relations of production of art that are inherently self-defined as unteachable. If an artist references the real world in the form of a pathetic failure to supply any knowledge of the referent, not necessarily out of any particular fault of their own, the irrelevance of the intended reference renders all references, unintended or otherwise, equally irrelevant, or equally relevant for that matter, as being logically constitutes the same thing. In arthood there is an equivalence between meaning intended and meaning not intended by any given author's work. BNP Paribas and their enthusiasm for state racism and violence, values presumably shared by the Tate, are just as external a reference as far as Deller's The Battle of Orgreave is concerned, as is the historic fact of Orgreave itself. The events in Orgreave on the 18th of June 1984, like Gaza, were not so much a battle as a state-orchestrated beating. That those events rhetorically constitute the title of the work itself is not an effective contribution with regard to those facts.
Lenin uses the metaphor of a mirror to describe how art functions in his analysis of Tolstoy, as holding up a mirror to the Russian Revolution, albeit a disfiguring one. Does Deleuze' The Battle of Orgreave constitute a reflection of the real events that took place on the 18th of June 1984 in Orgreave, South Yorkshire? This notion of art functioning as producing a reflection of the real world constitutes a pretty widespread theory that places a work such as Deleuze as offering some access through the metaphor of the work as a reflective surface itself, directed at some aspect of the real world. The metaphor of the mirror comes under scrutiny from within the system of art itself. If one considers that a mirror only reflects some aspect of the real world, or the superficial appearance of the thing it reflects, although it can and indeed is argued that art, by its association with the authoritative figure of the artist, in actual fact reflects more than mere appearances, but rather the reality obscured by them. For instance, its hidden structural nature that the artist, more than anyone else, is capable of accessing. So the artwork has the ability, mediated through the avant-garde model of the artistic subject, to raise the inherently pathetic and mundane nature of reality, revived and reflected through the creative mind of the figure of the specially endowed, autonomous, self-authenticating artist.
The materialism discussed at the beginning of the present text disputes the metaphysical idealist mystificatory theological logic that the artist, through the revelatory agency of their artwork, can adequately reflect reality. Whatever the artist does, whether consciously in relation to the real world or not, is itself materially determined. The figure of the artist may be associated with having some special access to a form of reflection, more superficial than anyone else's, but the artist is part of the real world's constitutive form, and therefore what they do is determined materially. More likely, Deleuze responds to the real world event of Orgreave, reflected or mediated as spectacle, in the form of an ideological form of art. Again, quoting De Boer, in societies dominated by modern conditions of production, life presented as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was directly lived has receded into representation. The problem here, for the idea of art as a reflection of the real world, is that the mirror may be broken and the reflection distorted by the ideology in which the artist and their output is situated, that their work constitutes an ideological class-based distortion. The reflection in this sense does not neutrally reflect the real world, but rather constructs its ideological version through equally materially constructed mind of the artist.
Deleuze's The Battle of Orgreave is opposed to the events it reflects or renders as an aesthetic object. Might be considered as an example of art as a category of positivism, in that it relates directly to real events. Although there is a suspicion that is proving difficult for us to shake off, that there is something particularly shifty about reconstructing such events. The idea of artistic positivism might deflect attention from its inability to distinguish from experience and representation of experience, whereas other less credible forms of art function as sublimates of artistic intuition, interpretation, feeling, response, etc. The notion of Deleuze's Battle of Orgreave as a positivist artwork, in that it constitutes a set of actual events, objectively reconstructed, albeit in absentia of the Cook Report, Crime Watch-esque grandiloquent community armchair home guard policing authority, obfuscates it as an idealist artwork, as an aesthetic object that encapsulates the event in some essential rarefied form. In contradistinction, is it possible that Deleuze's The Battle of Orgreave is a work of substantive truth based on a real knowledge of the really existing material world? But then again, the artist's mind constitutes an object of the really existing material world, and so any artistic output falls into such a category. In this positivist sense, Deleuze's The Battle of Orgreave constitutes a form of realism. It reflects reality in a way that metaphysical artistic reflections fail to do. Here, Orgreave, the real event, constitutes the base, and the Marxist topographical model. Deleuze's The Battle of Orgreave reflection, a superstructural constituent, art as an ideological version of the real world, it instantly fixes the base, or real world as an object as opposed to a part of an ongoing material historical process. The human actions as they really were, that materially produced the events in Orgreave, reduced to a fixed object, and subsequently produced the events that resulted in Deller's work, and additionally the materially determined material construction of Deller's artistic intentions in producing the work. Again, in this sense, Deller's The Battle of Orgreave is an alternative version of the really significant events. To other metaphysical forms of art of falsifying tendencies, such as to romanticise such events. But the presentation of a reflection of events as they were, particularly from the point of view of art as constituting a special province of production, reduces the likelihood of a substantive reflection in a positivist way. Deller's The Battle of Orgreave therefore constitutes an objective reflection of the real events in Orgreave, obviously only in terms of superficial appearance. Back to square one. What exactly is the point? Art cannot give us knowledge of the base or the reality of the real world, etc. Its ideological reflections can only be considered in terms of how much such reflections correspond or don't correspond with the actual events. Art's implicit relativism as being produced and consumed subjectively is in no way challenged by ideological reflections of significant events that correspond or conform to those events more or less than any other potential ideological versions do.
But Deller's name, voice, artistic authority, etc. hangs over his Battle of Orgreave, and consequently all over the real world events his Battle of Orgreave depicts, reconstructs, mediates, etc. Just as Nick Ross's mock judicious righteous tone hangs over a reconstructed bag snatch on Lewisham High Street, as well as over the apprehended perpetrator. Although there is at least the sign of a delegation of authorship in the film documentation of the reenactment element of the work being directed by someone other than Deller, this cannot certainly, within the sphere of artistic production, constitute an abrogation of any responsibility of authorship. Deller owns the meaning, whatever it is, that his work asserts an ideological art version of events. It constitutes an historical event offered up through the lens of a contemporary as opposed to a legitimate contemporaneous reflection. This is where Deller's form of mediation distinguishes itself from Nick Ross's form of mediation. Although both constitute a mediation of events through reconstruction, Deller's presumably constitutes a mediation of events through reconstruction or enactment as an artwork, as a point of access to the special province of art. Both Deller and Ross's mediations may be motivated similarly by a sense of justice, albeit from distinct sides of the state's authority, and or an awareness and clamouring for a clear trajectory, but Deller's is distinct in its condition of being an artwork. Deller's work relies on contingencies. It doubles down on its singular anti-dialectical nature. It is an historical reenactment, filmed, directed, packaged. In the event, it is a poor contemporary artwork, and it is an artwork, etc. In the event, it is a crass bourgeois exploitation of working class struggle. Deller's Battle of Orgreave is at odds with any claim to objectivity. It could be a truism to state that Deller's work is derivative, in the sense that it is derived from the events it reconstructs, but its status of being a reconstruction, specifically as opposed to being a representation, is instructive in elaborating its consequential relation to the significant real-world events it references. The idea, should it exist, one imagine it might have in Deller's head, that Deller's Battle of Orgreave constitutes a form of representational realism, a la Courbet's Stonebreakers, is difficult to substantiate given the conditions of current artistic production. Whatever Deller's Orgreave achieved, its fervent criticality and anti-authoritarianism did little to rock the foundations of the Academy, that its very production and seamless subsumption was catastrophically predetermined by.
It could though be argued that Deller's The Battle of Orgreave does not objectify the real events and render them inert, but rather engages with the real events in Orgreave as they existed, as part of a history of material human activity, i.e. it is too simplistic to see Deller's work as reducing the real life events at Orgreave as a static object, fixed and fixated as art. That the work does not merely superficially reflect the reality, but reflects rather the essential determining forces that ultimately produce the events themselves. In this way, Deller's work might constitute a dynamic form of realism. If on reflection a given work fails to reflect reality from the point of view of its essential determining forces, it presumably fails on grounds of superficiality and is quickly returned to its status as an ideological version of real events. The problem with the theory that the work of art functions reflectively in relation to the real world is that the metaphor instantly suppresses the materiality of the work as an example itself of the material social process. By reducing that material process to a mere reflection, the social aspect of artistic production is rendered impotent.
Perhaps mediation constitutes a more effective metaphor than reflection, and offers a more active analysis of artistic function, more appropriate for the whole material social process, that the work of art initiates a mediation between distinct human activities, between the work, the Battle of Orgreave, and the event. This allows the relation between the real world, or the base, and the superstructural artwork to maintain a dual relation with the process of human activity. By reducing the significance of the notion of art operating as a reflection and replacing it with a notion of art operating as a process of mediation, the objectification of real events by art is possibly averted. Mediation allows for the distinct, different nature of the two types of activity. In mediation, the process of referring to the real events is charged in the realised art version, and the notion of judging the art on the basis of its correspondence with the original event is circumvented. This change might be thought of as the art merely alluding to the event indirectly, or of expressing through the artwork just a limited aspect of the event, as opposed to it in its entirety expressed, encapsulated, etc. Then the work, say Deller's The Battle of Orgreave, offers an opportunity for an audience to work backwards, as it were, in the process of recovering from and mediated through the artwork back to the original events, the work initiating a process of edification that ultimately reveals the significance of the real event, again as mediated by the artwork. It is possible that an audience apprehending Deller's work, in for instance Tate, where, as mentioned, it was exhibited, were edified. Some of the audience might never have heard of Orgreave, or the Miners' Strike for that matter, and the work could conceivably have initiated further research. But this use of mediation between artwork and the real world event also exposes the potential of a distortion taking place between the artwork as ideology and the event as real. This distinction might be, and we'd argue in case of Deller, as constituting a vocal public representative of a social formation based upon the claims of transcending ideology, transcending its causes and transcending the conditions in which it is produced. Definitely is class-based. The original real-life event is obfuscated and distorted by a bourgeois ideology that determines its production and the relations of its distribution, its presentation within an institution such as the Tate. This form of ideological class-based distortion by mediation mirrors the mainstream media's representation of the events in Orgreave in '84, which similarly distorted the reality in the form of ideological versions for ideological class-based purposes.
What purpose does art that refers to or recreates or reenacts real events serve? In some sense, all art does this. At the least explicit level, art of an abstract nature refers to the events of previous abstractions, sometimes directly. At the most explicit level, level. Events are depicted or described in some material fetishized form. Deller's battle object would fall squarely into the latter category. Is its purpose to achieve something beyond the act of reference itself? Deller's battle object constitutes an example of artwork determined by the same conditions that determined the real-world subject matter of the artwork. It itself is a product of the same conditions it seeks but fails to reconstruct. Deller's battle object inevitable failure to represent the historic conditions, class antagonisms, etc. is illustrative of a lack of acknowledgement or understanding of its own complicity in the reproduction of the very same conditions, class antagonisms, etc. Deller's battle object constitutes an example of an idealist artwork, ironically a form of idealism yielding itself in various tropes of realism, working class communities and identities, industrial, labour, withdrawal, etc. It fails to engage with the social totality that would reveal itself as an artwork, as conditioned and determined by the same antagonisms its subjects are subjected to in the fetishized form of artistic idealism. Deller's battle object constitutes the antithesis of a dialectical artwork, which would a priori require an understanding and acknowledgement of itself and its subject as both forming fluid parts of the same totality. But Deller's battle object's subject matter, as mediated through the object of an artwork, constitutes an idealist recreation of real historical class antagonisms, which it itself perpetuates, a continuation of the same class antagonisms, itself embedded in the same privileged liberal bourgeois social relations that are inherently antagonistic to the subjugated subject of the Deller battle object. It exploits for its own realisation in its corporatist commodity form. As stated, this becomes explicitly identifiable in a consideration of the form of the work, specifically as a reenactment or reconstruction, as distinct from a representation, for instance. The material of a representation, paint, digital technology, etc., being conspicuously distinct from people enlisted from the same geographical and socially positioned communities, or those engaged in pastimes that cohere with the reenactments of events, presumably expenses paid in addition to remuneration in the form of social fulfillment or catharsis through Deller's amateur recovery memory trauma therapy. The rejection of or mangling of the dialectical approach applied to the production of a work about class antagonisms means the actual historical event is obscured and distorted to the point of destruction. This does not necessarily imply that a more or less close account of a particular historic event could not be given without the dialectical approach, but this would likely be constitutive of a representation as opposed to specifically a reconstruction, or more specifically a reenactment. But an anti-dialectical or idealist work such as Deller's battle object does put paid to a consideration of a historical event as proceeding within a unified totality. Deller's battle object constitutes a work that essentially, in a highly limited sense, describes an historical event while abrogating any consideration of itself as part of a unified process that incorporates the specific description itself and an opposition between a particular and a universal history. Quote, "The question of a unified approach to the process of history is inescapable. It is here that the crucial importance of the dialectical view of totality reveals itself. For it is perfectly possible for someone to describe the essentials of an historical event and yet be in the dark about the real nature of that event and of its function in the historical totality, i.e., without understanding it as part of a unified historical process." End quote from Lukács.
Outside of the sphere of art, events such as those in Orgreave on the 18th of June 1984 constitutes a set of changing relations and interactions, constantly changing in relation to various interactions, objects, etc., contributing towards the formation of a larger changing whole. The events of Orgreave manifest themselves as a change in relations to the social whole, and through this as a change in the form of objectivity itself. Thus the objective form of all social phenomena changes constantly in the course of their ceaseless dialectical interactions with each other. The dialectical approach to an event such as Orgreave, which Deller's reenactment categorically isn't, allows the possibility of an understanding of real-world events as social process. This approach initiates an understanding or presentation that dissolves the fetishistic form necessarily produced by the capitalist mode of production, which Deller's battle object categorically is, and enables us to see them as mere illusions which are not less illusory for being seen to be necessary. Representations such as Deller's, this is a Lukács quote, sprout just as inevitably from the soil of capitalism and veil the real relations between objects.
Representations such as Deller's constitute ideas necessarily held by the agents of the capitalist system of production, and therefore that they represent the ideology of the capitalist system's ruling class. Basically, Deller's battle object fails to remove the veil that allows historical knowledge to become possible. The function of fetishistic forms of pseudo-objectivity, such as Deller's battle object, is to make the phenomena of capitalist society appear as supra-historical. The knowledge of the real objective nature of an event, such as Orgreave, the knowledge of its historical character, and the knowledge of its actual function in the totality of society, is reduced to a single isolated, undivided fetishized object. Reality is concealed by the fetishistic illusion. Quote, "It is because the product he has created moves constantly away from him in the form of capital, the transaction is veiled by the fact that the product appears as a commodity and the commodity as money." End Marx quote.
And then this is Clapp. Chapter 9. An autotelic system and its autonomous output. And this is the final chapter, unfinished. Ours is essentially a tragic age, so we refuse to take it tragically. It's Lawrence. The system of art is self-describing, but not wholly self-determining. Art is a self-describing system that functions to reproduce the conditions of its own production, i.e. arthood, is heavily limited and continuously hamstrung by its own boundaries. Art is produced or determined economically even when described artistically, creatively, etc. This explains its limitations. The means by which art describes or reproduces itself, such as through exhibition, constitutes a failure to traverse its own boundaries. Art's limitations are best understood as seen through the topographical metaphor of the base and the superstructure. Within its boundaries, the system of artistic production is determined and reproduced, albeit under constant pressure exerted by the determining economic base. Labour being the obfuscated constituent that determines culture. Within its carefully orchestrated and increasingly limited boundaries, it functions purely ideologically. There is no art practice except by and in ideology. In this sense, art has no history because, as ideology, all its historical reality is external to it, beyond its boundaries. This means an attempt to justify current art on the basis that some other art was once made in the past does not substantiate current art. It will have to find other means by which to justify itself. Art constitutes a closed, self-describing system. Anything it refers to appropriates or infiltrates beyond its boundaries. It is instantly nullified and co-opted as an ideological version of the erstwhile significance, including, as stated, its own self-description and history. What this means, as stated, is that the system of art is self-describing, but it is not self-determining. It is self-describing in that it constitutes an operationally closed system. It is, though, specifically not self-determining because, although constituting a closed system, it still can be influenced by the environment beyond the boundaries of its closure, which are economic, capitalist, corporatist, racist, etc. Equally, we have to acknowledge that it can, as opposed to categorically is, influenced by the environment, because its abilities to break its own boundaries are speculative and provisional. They have the capacity to influence the environment beyond its boundaries. That this is likely does not mean it is less true, but it is important to acknowledge it might have potential to influence the environment beyond its own boundaries. But it is equally important to acknowledge that the influence, when weighed against the capacity of the self-described system to be determined by the wider environment, is asymmetrically massively outweighed. In this sense, above anything else, art constitutes a failure of communication. Within the parameters of art, its own history constitutes a process punctuated by particular ideological moments, ideological versions of its increasingly more failed, inadequate incursions into reality. Increasingly more failed because art's progress towards deeper subsumption and co-option of advanced, ever-advancing capitalist social formations means a truly emancipated form of art practice becomes ever less likely. The development of conditions that produce Jeremy Deller are proportional to the decline or even cessation of conditions that produce Courbet. Art can only ever function by concocting representations of arbitrary relations between individuals and their real conditions, which are external to the system of art. History, meaning, society and increasingly ever culture, perversely including art itself, is external to art, or rather external to arthood. Art constitutes merely a representation of merely meaningful things. A representation of really meaningful things, or which can only ever ineffectually refer. This is elaborated in its failure to communicate in any meaningful way. Art is defined by its failure to communicate.
The problem for art is that it is determined by the economic base, and the presumed autonomy of the artist is only possible as a mere function within the limited sphere of its surroundings or social formation. This must apply to all artists, not just those content to reproduce the current relations in which art is produced, but also those artists that are critical of the current relations in which art is produced, that wish to transform those relations. Problematically, those artists interested in emancipatory form of art practice are also mere functions of their surroundings and social environment. This throws up the question of what the practice by a truly emancipated artist would look like once the problem of how those artists hope to transform a system superstructural that they themselves are a mere ideological product of is resolved. Is there a way of maintaining an art practice that avoids reproducing the relations of capitalist modes of production? Can we produce a painting or a drawing, for example, that is predetermined by or contingent on its subsequent obsolescence or concealment, somehow materially disrupting the inevitability of its fated determination as a product of a determined superstructure produced by the determining economic base? How does one go about producing an artwork that could only be realised by the decision not to produce it in the first place? Can art do anything beyond the utterance of the question how to maintain an art practice in conditions that determine art as subsumed by capital?
If artists constitute a mere product of the system in which they function, irrespective of artists' own view of their work as the outcome of autonomous production and not as having been determined economically, referring back to Orwell's reaction to Tolstoy's criticism of Shakespeare, specifically the point that there is no test of artistic merit except survival, which is itself an index to majority opinion, then what is identified by Orwell as being worthy of merit, attained by its own earned survival, is only enacted in a very specific cultural sphere defined by dominance. Orwell's use of survival can only be acknowledged as the autotelic product of the dominant culture in which it is produced. What specific conditions exactly is the artwork surviving? A dominant culture that's domination stretches effortlessly, tendril-like, into examples of alternative or oppositional culture of a residual or emergent, incorporated or not yet incorporated kind. There is, in any given social formation, a dominant and effective system of practices. These practices are incorporated through various ideological apparatuses such as art education, art museums, art exhibitions, art residences, as a gateway into the dominant culture. The dominant and effective practices of the institution are selective and consequently exclude the full range of possible and potential human practices. For an art practice that intends to transform the dominant culture, always criterion of artistic merit as constituted by survival is meaningless. A vulgar success ethic of a cult of competition masquerading as historical truth.
Culture is determined by labour, meaning that for culture to be produced it requires society to reproduce, essentially to maintain an economic surplus beyond necessity or essential requirements. Having a roof over your head may constitute a necessity, it being designed by Thomas Heatherwick constituting an unnecessary use of surplus. That culture is the product of labour is ever more explicit and direct a correlation within advanced capitalist society, the kind of society that produces Jeremy Deller's Battle of Orgreave. Value in art, education, etc. has become increasingly to the point of necrosis, in fact, determined by the market. Use has been almost entirely replaced by exchange with regard to notions of value. But culture does not generally consider itself to be the product of surplus raised through the lowest possible remuneration for labour extracted, of being wholly material in its origins. Culture prefers to negate this determining connection by maintaining that it is consuming itself as an autotelic, self-generating autonomous system. Art maintains that it is autonomous from its own system. This manifests itself at the point of exhibition, distribution, etc. as a failure of communication, a failure to acknowledge what in actual fact it is. Art's claim to being autonomous, to produce autonomous objects, is in a sense what connects it materially to a wider social environment as a subsystem of a wider social system, as it coincides with the rise of the individual and the demise of the collective or community. The commodification of art produced for the market, whether intentionally, purposefully or not, as opposed to a specific audience, coincides with the fully autonomous work of art in that it becomes autonomous or estranged from its traditional social function, tied to some buried notion of use. Art as a self-describing entity coincides with its commodification, in the same way that Romanticism coincided with the expansion of industrial capitalism.
Evaluation is an everyday act concurrent with production. Not to evaluate is to commodify or capitulate to commodification. The suspension of evaluation and judgment, essentially criticism, produces the commodity form. Exhibition is essentially the product of this suspension. Herein lies its offensiveness. It is exactly the commodity form that refuses to evaluate, to criticise, to communicate, which results in bland equalisation, making all exchanges abstract, pluralistic, and ultimately equal. That kind of logic, previously confined to the marketplace and circumvented by artistic practices, has increasingly penetrated such practices wholesale, the realm of artistic culture itself.
Imagine you're witness to an example of cultural activity in a different society to your own, one which you have no prior knowledge of. What evaluative framework could you deploy in attempting to assert if it's, for instance, good or bad? What could you say beyond truisms or platitudes? As an outsider, assertions of good, bad, etc. would remain meaningless. You couldn't substantively say it was good or bad because you wouldn't have access to the specific cultural criteria that determines its qualitative appreciation within that specific context. You would be left only with utterances based on observation of appearances or platitudes. You would need access to the criteria, access to the system.
Is the art system similarly inaccessible? What constitutes its criteria for evaluation? The contradiction of the lack of evaluative potential yielding its commodification. And this needs to be considered and expanded on later.
There we go.